Resident Evil has evolved quite a bit since it first debuted 30 years ago. It had 6 straight games of fixed camera scares, but when that was seemingly getting stale, RE4 came out and redefined the series as an action horror game. From there, the franchise tried to expand on the action elements of RE4 and left the horror element behind. Many think RE4 is to blame for this series losing its way, whether they think that game is good or not, and regardless of how the series has tried to return to its horror roots in recent years. So today I'm looking back at my old videos on RE4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 4 Remake to think about how RE4 changed the series and how the later games were losing themselves and how RE7 got the series back on track. Original videos will resume next week as I've been out of town for about a week now, but in the meantime I hope you enjoy, whether you've seen these videos or not. Now let's talk RE4.
Were you aware that Resident Evil 4 was going to be Devil May Cry?
You probably were. This is one of those gaming facts that's so well known that you aren't cool for knowing it, but I'm talking about it anyway because I actually didn't before playing this game. I said I first bought RE4 back in 2018, and it was on that day in GameStop where I was sifting through the PS4 section and saw that the Devil May Cry HD collection and Resident Evil 4 were right next to each other, both of which are popular Capcom IPs I hadn't played, Capcom being one of my favorite publishers in the industry, so why not give them a shot? I had only played DMC at first and became obsessed with the franchise, it being one of my other favorite IPs. See the poster on the other side of the RE4 one. When I reviewed Devil May Cry 1, 2, and 3 in a video, I had mentioned RE4 being a game I had got alongside it but had yet to play, to which the comments then told me about this being ironic given the shared history of these games. Numerous Resident Evil projects were in development at once in the late 90s and early 2000s. Hideki Kamiya, director of Resident Evil 2, was working on RE4 for the PlayStation 2. This game being more gothic in its art design than previous RE games with a focus on sick, stylish action. Shinji Mikami, director of RE1, had said that the game was straying a little too far from what the RE series was and that this new game might just be better off as a new IP, and thus Devil May Cry was born. Retaining some of the exploration, isolated setting, and spooky vibes, but with badass sword combat against an army of demons. I just find this story so interesting because it concerns two of my favorite games, and them sprouting from the same origin point was just cool to learn. RE4 then started anew, going through numerous revisions on the idea, still centering itself around the traditional fixed camera gameplay the RE series was known for, bringing Raccoon City survivor Leon Kennedy back to the forefront for this one. However, things had changed while RE4 was being worked on. I had mentioned in my video on Resident Evil Remake and Resident Evil 0 that franchise fatigue was setting in for RE. 0 was the 6th mainline game to feature the same kind of gameplay and progression. Critics had liked both games, but felt that the RE formula was a bit played out. These two games being GameCube exclusives had hurt their sales as well. Mikami simply thought it was time for the RE series to do something much different if it was going to be a relevant series. Kind of ironic considering the fact that this idea is why DMC became its own property to begin with. But perhaps it's just a case of hindsight being 2020. Mikami stated that the RE games by Remake and 0 just started to feel predictable, losing a lot of the tension that you had when the PS1 games were new. I think Remake is the best designed classic RE game, but I can definitely see where he and all the critics at the time were coming from, considering the fact that in 6 years there were 6 main games, 2 of which released in the same year. RE0 separated itself from the 5 previous entries with a boatload of gimmicks that I didn't think added to the experience in any meaningful way. On top of that, the experience the gimmicks were trying to add onto was one I had little to say about because yeah, it's all been said and done before. So Resident Evil 4 was going to go in a new, action-oriented direction to hopefully breathe some life into the series. Evidently, not everyone on the team felt passionate about RE4's new direction, and I can imagine why. I mean, your skills and interests have been with slower-paced horror games, and now you have to make a game with explosions, roundhouse kicks, and minecart rides? I'd imagine it was jarring, and I can also imagine it being kind of scary in a way to do something new like this. Who knows if people would even like it? Is this the moment Resident Evil jumps the shark and can never recover? But thankfully, that's not how it played out. After several scrapped builds and a whole new franchise rising from it, Resident Evil 4 finally released on the GameCube in early 2005, and it is one of the most critically acclaimed games of all time. Perfect scores from countless outlets, a near-perfect audience response, several awards for Game of the Year, Game of the Decade, and now greatest games of all time. Also, one of the most influential games to ever exist, right up there with classics like Super Mario Bros. Or Zelda Ocarina of Time. Redefining survival horror and third-person shooter games entirely, inspiring a plethora of iconic games like Dead Space and The Last of Us. Selling over 1 million copies on GameCube, but then the floodgates were opened when the game was ported to the PlayStation 2 where it sold over 2 million copies, which is something I speculated about in my Remake video. That the audience for a mature game is just going to be bigger on the other consoles. But I also think RE4 was a lot different. Remake and 0 were more Resident Evil. Resident Evil 4 was a gaming phenomenon, one of those games you have to play and have an opinion on. At this point, RE4 has been ported to pretty much every console that has ever existed since its release, selling over 11 million copies since it first debuted. Which begs the question, How am I going to play this classic game for the video? As I just said, there's an exhaustive list of RE4 re-releases, so I won't even try to cover that in this video. I own the game on GameCube, PS2, Wii, PS3, PS4, and PC. The GameCube version is the original, so it has its charm, seeing the game as originally presented. The PS2 port added a lot of new content that's synonymous with the game at this point, but is awful in terms of sound quality and visuals, everything being massively downgraded to fit the entire game onto one DVD. The Wii is a really popular option that I have actually never played before, but people really dig it due to its motion-controlled aiming. Perhaps I'll get to it another day. The PS3 and 360 was the game's first time appearing in HD, although it was still 30 FPS like its prior releases. The Ultimate HD edition on PS4, Xbox One, and Steam was its first time being 60 FPS, making me gravitate towards that. The PC version gets bonus points because the HD editions of RE4, like Remake, have very poorly upscaled textures, making the game look pretty dated when playing it in HD. One of the main reasons I like to stick to playing old games on old consoles. However, shortly after the HD edition's release in 2014, a passionate fan team began working on a total texture overhaul to make a proper 4K rendition of RE4 that you can mod onto the Steam version for PC. Now it's fully playable and free to download, you just have to own the game on Steam. 60 FPS alone made the 8th gen version of RE4 the best one, but this PC project makes that pretty hard to dispute in my eyes since it's the cleanest visually and offers so many great quality of life features like being able to expand the field of view, which is why the game looks zoomed out in this footage for any RE4 veterans who are wondering about that. I'll leave a link to their page below, it's excellent stuff. Now with all that said, it's time we dive into RE4 and really see what makes it such a special game. I see no better time to begin than the present, so let's do it.
Resident Evil 4.
RE4 paves a new path for the series from the opening cutscene. It begins with a monologue from Leon who goes over everything you need to know about the status quo of the RE series thus far. The first 5 games in the timeline were all about the T-Virus developed by Umbrella Corp. Leon recaps that the incidents from the mountains in RE0 and RE1 had led to the T-Virus leaking into Raccoon City in RE2 and 3. RE3 ending with the city being wiped off the face of the earth from a missile attack to stop the virus from spreading. Each game was building upon the mystery of Umbrella more and more. As RE1 established the basics of them and the virus, RE2 showed how the entire city was bought off by Umbrella, RE3 put the consequences of those actions on full display, and then Code Veronica and RE0 had fleshed out the backstory a little more. By the end of Code Veronica, it seemed like the next time was finally going to be the game where Umbrella gets taken out, something RE2 also hyped up. However, like I said, RE4 is not interested in doing more of the same. The first sign of that is that the game takes place 6 years after the Raccoon City arc. Leon quickly establishes before the opening is even over that Umbrella's being behind the T-Virus that destroyed Raccoon City was revealed, an obvious PR disaster. Their stock price fell and Umbrella went out of business. That was the end of that. I suppose if you spent all those years hyped to see a game about taking down Umbrella, but the resolution was them losing all their money and going out of business, that would be pretty anticlimactic, although not entirely unrealistic. Not to say RE4 has nothing to do with Umbrella, because it does, those consequences hang over the rest of the series, but that the story is not following the same mold as the previous ones. It was intentional as they wanted to tell a new story. Leon Kennedy, following his survival in RE2, was recruited by the US government to become one of the agents responsible for protecting the president and his family, receiving all kinds of training to become an action movie badass. The president's daughter, Ashley, was abducted from her university, and now it's up to Leon to travel to a mysterious, rural part of Europe to find her. But he encounters a village full of hostile locals attacking him with pitchforks, axes, and chainsaws. Leon must get through the hordes to rescue Ashley, but also contend with the cult of the area, the Los Illuminados, who have infected the entire village, as well as Leon and Ashley with their virus, Las Plagas, a parasite that takes over your body and makes you a slave to the Los Illuminados, currently led by Osmond Sadler. Leon and Ashley's only hope being that the virus takes a long time to fully take over, so that they have to not only escape from these enemies, but also find a cure before it's too late, setting up Resident Evil 4. Now that we can get into the gameplay, what makes RE4 so stand out from a gameplay perspective? After all, the game still utilizes the same tank controls as the previous games did. The only directions you can go in are forward, left, right, and backwards, using the quick turn to move 180 degrees on a dime. If you're familiar with the previous games, this should be something you can get to grips with. It's the fixed camera angles that are gone. Instead, the camera is centered behind Leon's back and you use the right analog stick to see what his immediate surroundings are. The change to the camera makes the controls feel completely new. This game doesn't have any of the jank that would come from switching screens with an analog stick that the previous games had because the camera is centered on Leon's back. If you've played more modern games, it'll be a bit of an adjustment that you have to stop and then quick turn to move around, but it clicks fast. At least, it does for me. Some people despise tank controls in the previous games, and I never really had a counter-argument to that besides, well, it worked for me, and the same pretty much goes for RE4. Now that's just the camera. It's the shooting that was the most revolutionary thing in RE4. Before this game, there was no set industry standard on how to handle third-person shooting. The first Halo game on Xbox had pretty much standardized the twin-stick model of shooting on consoles in first person, but in third person you'd have all kinds of systems that varied from game to game. The RE games relied on the same lock-on they always had, and games like Ratchet & Clank had improved the strafing and lock-on with each game, eventually working in the twin-stick shooting with its third-person gameplay. The Metal Gear games relied on first-person aiming modes but allowed you to run and shoot by holding down multiple buttons if you needed to shoot in third person, but it never felt very good to do. Resident Evil 4 standardized over-the-shoulder shooting. It's hard to imagine a gaming landscape where this wasn't a standard feature, but this game is the one to make it a universal thing. You press one of the shoulder buttons and Leon will lift his gun, and you move the stick to point where he's going to aim and then fire in that direction. And then after that, all other third-person action games, including ones released in the franchises I just mentioned, adopted this playstyle because there was no better way to go about it. If you play RE4 for the first time after having played games inspired by it, it will seem a bit odd because Leon is frozen in place during this aiming mode when later third-person shooters allow the character to move while aiming and shooting. RE4 simply does not, which is the hardest part about getting into this game. When you do get into it, you realize that this wasn't an oversight in the design of RE4, it was built this way on purpose. Resource management has always been a core pillar of the Resident Evil games, and RE4 has taken that philosophy and designed a combat system with that in mind. You'll get a lot more ammo in RE4 than any previous game in the series, whether that be from crates or just being dropped by defeated enemies, giving you the ability to blast through foes like never before. However, you also don't want to just waste all the ammo you have on every enemy you see. First, it's because you can't just hoard a stockpile of ammo anyway. The game introduces an entirely new system for the inventory. Pausing the game opens your inventory case, a grid system where different items like herbs, ammo, and guns take up a differing amount of space, as you can customize how they're arranged to make sure you have enough space for all the stuff in your possession. Organizing things in RE4 is a game in its own right, each upgrade to your storage feeling really satisfying as you can then expand the possibilities of how you manage the space you have. But back to the actual gameplay. The combat is a loop of aiming for weak spots on enemies like their heads or their knees, causing them to stagger, which allows you to get close and execute a combo move like a kick or a full-on suplex. This is not just to look cool, it's also useful because you get plenty of invincibility frames while doing it, important when dealing with crowds. If that didn't finish them off, the knife is now a permanent item that doesn't take up any space in your inventory. You grab it with another one of the shoulder buttons and can use it to bust boxes or slash at downed enemies, hopefully finishing them off before they get back up. So you do have lots of ammo at all times, but you want to make intelligent use of the aiming system by only firing at the weak spots and doing close quarters combat from there, thus saving your ammo for bosses or just bigger enemies like the chainsaw guy. This game is pretty long, and yet this combat loop is something I never get sick of. It keeps you engaged with the moment-to-moment action. Your mind is always on your inventory and what weapons are best suited for different circumstances, and it's also optimized for tension. Like I said, you can't move while aiming. As a result, when multiple enemies start to approach Leon, you really hope you can land a good headshot and then kick one of those enemies, sending them all flying away from you, giving you the chance to put some more distance between you and them. The enemies themselves are also an exciting part of RE4's combat. Mikami said in reference to Remake and Zero that Resident Evil was losing a lot of its tension. Yeah, that introduced new enemies like Remake's Crimson Heads or Zero's Leeches, but the basic zombie routine was starting to become mundane and predictable. The Ganados you face in RE4 are completely new in how you approach them. First, because of the game's combat controls. Second, because of the AI. Zombies walked slowly and did one thing: bite. Once you've figured out how to get past zombies in RE1, and maybe after you've adjusted how many enemies are on screen in RE2, the basic zombie is just not a threat in RE3 and onward. The Ganados can swarm players, attacking you from all directions, and can wield weapons like I mentioned before. Some toss axes at you, toss explosives, or try to get up close with pitchforks and blowtorches. Every one of these attacks has different strategies you can use to dodge them, like shooting the explosives once they've been tossed so that they destroy the enemy and the ones surrounding them instead of you. But since you can't move while aiming, it's a risk versus reward system. Enemies can also duck and dodge as they approach you, throwing off your shaky aiming. Because of all this, I'm sure you can see why the combat in RE4 left such an impression on both Resident Evil fans and the general gaming audience. It was a fresh new experience with a plethora of different tactics you have to learn to use and fight against. The prologue ends with Leon in a massive firefight against the entire village. In my many playthroughs of this game on New Game Plus, I've become super adept at this section, but when starting a fresh file with less health and no weapons, getting your butt kicked here is pretty common. This part serves as a pretty good tutorial for the entire game as the enemies are relentless. Taking them head on with all your ammo is very liable to get you killed. Instead, your best practice is exploring the different houses to find more ammo and supplies like the shotgun. But you have to move fast because any house you bust into, they will kick down the door of. Any upper area you find is one they'll put a ladder up next to. There's no escape, you must strategically fight your way through them, and it's pretty exciting on every playthrough, as the horde only leaves upon hearing the church bell.
Where's everyone going? Bingo?
Throughout the campaign, the combat stands tall on a mechanical level, but the experience is heightened via the game's sound design. I wouldn't call RE4 a scary game by any means. To be fair, there weren't that many moments I was scared of in the earlier games besides the ever-present fear of losing progress, but I'd say RE4 wasn't really going for a truly scary vibe. Tense is the word I'd go for, and the game is packed full of it. I've already explained how the combat mechanics and enemies create tension when put together, but combine that with the sound and that's when you get an atmosphere unique to RE4. The game almost exclusively plays music in combat. Outside of that, you have the usual safe areas where you get music, but otherwise the OST consists mostly of battle themes that kick in when fighting enemies. You'll walk into a room and music will start playing. You might not even know where the enemies are or which they might be, however the music is a cue that you need to stay alert at this moment and it really works wonders. On the flip side, when you finally clear a room of enemies and the music vanishes, you're met with silence, and it's a relieving feeling when it might be used to heighten the fear factor in other games. While in combat, you'll hear the enemies scream at you from all directions, but you can only see what's in front of, above, and next to Leon, so hearing sounds from behind further increases that tension mid-combat. Even using that effect for fake-out jump scares, like when you walk into the castle sewers and hear every time I get somewhat anxious hearing that, but there was nothing behind you. But when you hear it next, you're met with enemies that can go invisible. You always gotta stay alert in this game. RE4 takes these elements that are in many ways different and unorthodox and uses them to craft an experience like no other, and I think that still holds up when playing it today. As established, it's endlessly replayable because of this tense survival horror shooter combat. It's good that the game is replayable based on that alone because replayability has always been another core tenet of the franchise, RE4 just getting it from a completely different source than previous games. Resi 4 is not a game about items being required for progression and the game getting faster if you know where they all are and in what order you need to obtain them like the previous games. This game is almost entirely linear. You do revisit some of the same locations, like how the opening area leads to the main village, and you circle back to this spot several times throughout the village chapter, or how you can't progress forward when you arrive at the castle, so you do a complete circle around the entire thing, collecting the items you need to get through the area previously closed off. But getting through that is not an element that requires thought. You pretty much just follow the path the game gives you and you will eventually wind up exactly where you need to be, no backtracking required. Sometimes you'll find key items that are needed to progress, like a key that opens the door, but oftentimes you get that by defeating all the enemies in the room and opening the door that leads to the next area, or just find the key items while you're circling through areas. It's nothing like past games on that note. After my playthrough of RE0, I certainly can't complain, but that's not to say RE4 brings nothing to the table in terms of exploration. Within each major segment of the game, you can get your hands on a treasure map which does exactly what you'd expect. You can use this to know what areas you should be looking out for, as loads of rooms will hide treasures for players curious enough to find it. Like shooting this light in the cave where each chain had treasure on the end of it, or shooting the back wall of the castle's main entrance. You wouldn't really have a reason to look towards the way you came in, but if you do, treasure for you. But what do you do with all that treasure? Another new mechanic in Resi 4 is the merchant. This dude who has set up shop throughout the locations in the game and sells Leon all kinds of goods in exchange for currency you find from defeated enemies or in boxes. There's a lot you can do here. From the merchant, you can sell off your treasure for a high price, but managing your treasure is another sub-game in and of itself. Like older titles, you can combine things in the menu, only it's not meant to solve puzzles, but rather you can combine certain treasures to make them more valuable. In the castle, you find the butterfly lamp, which is worth a lot on its own, but it has 3 extra slots. The invisible enemies drop one of 3 gems, red, green, and blue. You need to place one of each in the slots to make the lamp worth a lot more than it was before, blue gems being the most rare drop from the invisible bug enemies. So you either choose to cash in quickly and get a lower rate, or you wait until you find all 3 gem types and then sell for a higher price. Everything is useful in this game, like the herbs you find. Green ones still boost your health, red maximizes the effects of green, and now you have yellow herbs that combine with green to increase your maximum health. I always spend my first playthrough on a fresh file upgrading Leon's health bar, but then we'll focus on upgrading Ashley's on New Game Plus. If I come back to that file again, yellow herbs can still be mixed with the other types and then sold for a decent price to the merchant. That's what I mean when I say everything is useful in this game, regardless of how many playthroughs you've done. From the merchant, you can buy things like the treasure maps or the upgraded item slots. But most importantly, new weapons, and there's an exhaustive list of them in this game. When I play, I try to focus on the essentials. I always keep a handgun for direct encounters, a shotgun for crowd control, a sniper for distance, and the TMP for enemies with a lot of health. Later in the game, I do get one of the magnums for extra damage once I can fit it in my inventory. There are several types of weapons, but then multiple weapons in the same class. Like this handgun being better at piercing enemies, but this one fires faster. I sell my handgun pretty early so I can get my hands on the Red 9 gun, which can be upgraded with a stock to better stabilize your aim. Although a fully maxed out handgun gets this headshot multiplier where your chance of getting a critical hit goes up by 5 times, really turning the tides in your favor, especially on professional difficulty, so I wouldn't say you should sell it if doing damage is what you want to do the most. But then for the other weapon types, you'll get a regular shotgun and rifle early, but when you reach the castle and the island, newer, stronger models will be in the shop so you can sell the ones you already have and get the better ones, which is what I do. Then you'll switch over to the merchant's third tab and see you can buy upgrades to your weapons like an increase to the rate of fire, the fire power, the reload time, and the maximum ammo count. These are all lifesavers, like the reload times. Early in the game, reloading mid-fight could get you damaged, but when it's quicker, you feel really unstoppable. I love upgrading the ammo capacity on weapons I'm out of ammo for, as it also gives you a full supply when you buy it. Another strategic element that arises from the game's shop mechanic. The asshole doesn't sell you any ammo though, despite being surrounded by it at all times, but hey, can't make it too easy, right? On that note, RE4 introduces all the things I've talked about thus far within the first 90 minutes or so. But the game is not content with that status quo for the next several hours of gameplay. This game is constantly introducing new things to shake up the experience. After the first chapter of the game is over, you'll see some Ganados, same as what you've gotten used to at this point, but then the Plagas will burst out of this guy's head. While in this state, the Ganado will be more like a zombie, but you need to worry about the ultra-powerful parasite that bursted on top of him that will lunge a long claw at the player doing massive damage, adding a new dynamic to fighting enemies as you might aim for the head since it's the biggest weak spot in the Ganados, but you need to be careful because they might expose the Plagas if you do. Pro tip, the Plagas heads are weak to the flashbang grenades. It will destroy them in one hit and stun other enemies. Everything has a use in this game. As if that wasn't good enough, you rescue Ashley shortly after that, which also changes the dynamic of the game for the next hour or so of gameplay. The player has to make sure enemies don't get to Ashley again and take her away, and also manage her health bar with your inventory. You need to fight enemies for yourself and for her too, as her dying or getting abducted is a game over. With Ashley, you can hide her in dumpsters when they show up while you beat enemies, or just hope you have the skills to make sure both you and her survive, like this enemy rush in the castle. While on the move, you can command her to follow you or to hold off, or use machinery needed to progress while you keep fighting enemies. Can't say the game has any complex brain teasers as a result of this dynamic. In fact, I'd say these are the easiest puzzles in any RE game I've ever played. Like this one where the solution is just hitting 1, then 2, then 3, then 4. Or this other one where Ashley has to stand on one switch on one side of a door, and then Leon has to go to the other located 5 steps away. I only highlight this one because I'm betting Sucker Punch was inspired by this puzzle of all things for the double button security doors in Sly 3. Gotta mention Sly somewhere. Ashley will follow Leon for a while after rescuing her from the village, but whenever the game has gotten a lot of mileage out of protecting her, she'll be recaptured in a cutscene and you'll have to go back to just playing as Leon until you rescue her for the final time at the end of the game. Again, this game is packed full of variety. Nothing ever goes on too long because it's constantly refreshing itself. Whether that's via Ashley being with you or not with you, or the game introducing a new boss that comes with a different strategy than before, or an enemy rush where the player's overwhelmed by hordes of Ganado bursting into the tiny house you're holed up in, climbing a tower with an elevator that more enemies keep jumping down, or riding on a minecart where you need to shoot enemies and obstacles before running into them, or battling these enemies that hit like a tank but can't see, only tracking you via the sound you make. I managed to get this first one in a loop for an easy kill, to my surprise. The castle also has a great mini-boss with Verdugo in the sewers. This one is tense with the limited camera as it's chasing you, intimidating as an enemy since it absorbs bullets but has an interesting strategy to defeat it, knocking over these liquid nitrogen capsules to freeze it temporarily. A rocket launcher just destroys it in one shot while frozen, giving you a massive treasure reward. But there's options here as you don't even need to defeat it at all if you want to save that ammo by waiting for the elevator to show up. More of that RE4 variety at its finest. You start off in the village for the first few hours with the basic Ganado and the village chief as your antagonist. Once you clear that, you make it to the castle run by Ramon Salazar, who is your new foil. And you have tougher enemies via the cultists. Many of the same principles apply from the villagers, but these guys have deadlier weapons, more armor, and are generally creepier, growing their own kind of Plagas heads that will attack you after their former host is defeated entirely. This castle segment lasts a few more hours, and then you reach the island where Sadler's hiding out with new enemies yet again that are the toughest in the game before you reach the final boss with Sadler himself. I hear that some people start to lose steam with this game once you reach the island, although I personally can't relate. The boss with Salazar certainly feels like a final boss in terms of the climactic build-up, but the island does enough in terms of new set pieces like the car chase or the scaffold monster fight to feel new. Introducing threats like regenerators that move and try to eat you like a zombie, but have, as the name suggests, health and appendages that grow back unless you use an infrared scope on your rifle to see their external Plagas parasites. The introduction of this monster probably being the scariest part of the game as it busts down the door it was behind, just outside of the player's view. Then the game mixes up how you fight the thing every time one of them shows up, like how some have Plagas you shoot in the front, but then others have them on their backs, and so you need to shoot their legs first to expose their weak spots. It's plenty to keep you mechanically engaged. Which is great because the story is certainly not going to do that on its own. Perhaps that's a bit too harsh. I just mean to say that RE4's plot is not one for the ages, and that's mostly due to the presentation. Now, I think RE4 is the most entertaining plot in the series thus far. Visually, I mean that unironically, as the game has all these motion-captured action scenes that still capture your attention. Even the slow-motion bits, a common 2000s cliche, didn't feel out of place in these cutscenes like they did in other works from the time. You're forced to pay attention to the cutscenes as they include QuickTime events, another industry staple from the late 2000s that got popularized by this game. But its usage of them in cutscenes is what forces you to be on the edge of your seat during action scenes, if the visual spectacle wasn't enough. Now, ironically, I find this game very entertaining because this might be the hammiest script in the series since RE1. RE2 and onward felt a lot more straight-faced in terms of story, RE1 and Code Veronica just feeling like the hammy elements were an accident. The case could be made for RE1 that it was supposed to be like a sci-fi B-movie, which I get, but acting that bad just doesn't feel like a joke to me. But if RE1 was trying to be a cheesy sci-fi B-movie, then RE4 is entirely trying to be a cheesy American action spy thriller type movie. As I said way before, Leon has just gotten magic agent training that leaves him prepared for every single situation, like a grappling hook on his belt, or the ability to run up walls and backflip over lasers. It's funny how this John Wick type action just became Leon's character for the entire rest of the series. If it's RE2 era Leon, you gotta write him as a normal human, but post RE2, I would be surprised if there was a stunt he couldn't survive. But as I was saying, Leon is packed full of one-liners in this game, and sometimes it genuinely lands, like the bingo line at the beginning of the prologue, or the famous,
"I've sent my right hand to dispose of you."
Your right hand comes off?
but other times I'm chuckling at the dialogue because it's terrible.
"I let our miserable insects out for some exercise down in the sewer."
Thanks. That should keep me company, 'cause boredom kills me.
"I've been expecting you, my brethrens."
No thanks, bro.
Perhaps you are disillusioned with overconfidence, just because you killed my small-time subordinate.
Sadler, you're small time.
But like RE1, whether it was meant to be ironic or not, I always have a great time with the story because it's so entertaining. I just mean to say that if you care about the raw plot of the RE games, RE4 is not going to offer that much. Although, there is some interesting lore to follow in this game via the optional files. This game not directly being about Umbrella again allows the pages of text you find to feel more interesting because we don't know anything about Las Plagas or the Los Illuminados, so hearing about what the parasite does is interesting rather than feeling samey. The Plagas has an intriguing history, having been sealed away in the caverns of the castle generations ago by the Salazar family as they stood watch over it for decades, hoping the evil of the Los Illuminados would never rise again. But Ramon Salazar felt like that treatment was harsh and personally aided the group's revival, which started by infecting the villagers with the parasite as members of it were contracted to explore the caverns for it. The credits of the game show you that this village used to be a peaceful and joyous community before Sadler arrived and became their master, as these innocent people became the vicious combatants that Leon has faced off against at the start of the game. When I first saw this, I was thinking, darn, maybe I should feel bad the game is so much fun. One playthrough later, nah, it's pretty fun to play, but darn, that's pretty messed up backstory. However, to return to the main plot, some parts don't make any sense, like how the game introduces this new character called Jack Krauser. He was once a fellow agent alongside Leon, but was presumed dead until he joined forces with Sadler, capturing Ashley to gain his trust. The game introduces this guy in this cinematic moment where he dramatically looks into the camera, as if the audience should be shocked that Krauser's in the game, making me think he was a pre-established character in the series, since this was my first RE game. But he's a completely new character invented for this game, so what was the point of the dramatic reveal? I don't get it. The only impression he leaves on you after you beat the game is how easily broken his boss fight is with the knife. They also introduced Luis Serra as an ally to Leon who has been the one doing the research on the parasite for Sadler, but is now on the run from the Los Illuminados. He's likable when he appears, but then he gets this really dramatic death scene that does not feel remotely earned with this super campy story when he's only appeared like 3 times before this. But then they don't make dramatic things nearly as dramatic as they could be. Ada is back in RE4, but in canon, Leon learned of Ada's survival off-screen, so therefore the story doesn't get much out of their first scene together. To be fair, in the original RE2, Leon can clearly hear that Ada was the one to drop him the rocket launcher, when in the remake of that game he has no idea where it came from, presuming Ada was dead at the end. I'm just saying that the story could have gotten some drama out of this scene if they wanted to do that. Instead, Leon just confirms that Ada works for Wesker, who is scheming something in this story. It's just not confirmed in this game until the end, where Ada gets away with the Plagas sample. In the PS2 release of RE4, they added a new mode called Separate Ways, starring Ada. It shows what she was up to during various points of Leon's mission. The main campaign shows that she's watching you from the shadows, but it's here where we see some examples. Ada was the one to ring the church bell in the opening to draw the Ganados away from Leon, or how she saved him from the village chief. Wesker wanted Leon, a survivor of Raccoon City, to be eliminated, but Ada went against the plan and saved him from Krauser. She has affection for Leon, but like always, she's got a bottom line, and that was getting Leon to beat Sadler so she could get the Plagas sample and finish her mission. Separate Ways is a significantly truncated route through some of RE4's content while playing as Ada, so there isn't much to say besides the story stuff. Except the presentations of the cutscenes, that is. They are as well made as the ones from the main game, but since this was created for the PS2 version, all the cutscenes are pre-rendered and are quite crusty as a result. I mentioned at the top of the video that this version was significantly downgraded in terms of sound and visual quality to fit on the disc. But it's cool that they added some post-game content in a game that already has so much of it in the campaign. I mean, it was only about a year and a half ago when I first decided to try out the Mercenaries mode, and I was kicking myself for having never played it sooner. This is an entire mode where you have to eliminate as many enemies as possible on these 4 combat maps, 3 of which were lifted from the campaign. You have a time limit that you can extend with hourglasses scattered throughout the maps, as you then get more points for consecutive eliminations that can be multiplied with this point bonus multiplier you find. You start only as Leon, but then you can unlock Ada, Wesker, Krauser, and Hunk, one of the agents who tried to recover the G-Virus from RE2, which caused the T-Virus to leak into the city. Turns out this guy was playable in the 4th Survivor mode from RE2, which I didn't even know existed until like 2 seconds ago, because you need to get an A rank in a campaign of RE2, and I just happen to be terrible at the rankings of those games. But all that's neither here nor there. Mercenary mode caused my playtime of RE4 to skyrocket because I can simply turn the game on and play a few maps as a couple characters and call it a day. The game's combat mechanics are great fun, and so a mode just dedicated to that with the element of trying to get as many enemies beaten before the combo counter runs out is always fun, each character coming with different weapons and abilities that further increases the variety. Kind of a shame that Leon is the weakest character in terms of weapon selection, but still, the extra challenge is nice. Wesker being really fun to play as with all the ammo and weapons he gets. Krauser getting special powers like he did in the campaign. Ada has more ammo than Leon, so sometimes I'll play as her over him, but regardless of whichever character you pick, you're bound to have a good time. Which I suppose is how you could sum up the entire game. RE4 is endlessly replayable, even in the campaign as you unlock New Game Plus, where all your equipment carries over as you replay the game, now being way more powerful as you continue to upgrade your weapons and get better ones. Or you could start a new fresh file on professional difficulty for an even greater challenge. This took me a while to get through, but it was really satisfying. Beating the game on professional difficulty awarding you with this screen nuke laser gun, and beating Separate Ways gives you an unlimited ammo machine gun, and you can then buy an infinite ammo rocket launcher from the merchant, turning you into an unstoppable force. As I said at the beginning of the video, I've played this game a lot in the last almost 3 years, but every time I get that rocket launcher and destroy the final boss and make it through the final escape sequence, I feel really satisfied. The game remaining so fun during all these modes and levels and repeat playthroughs says a lot. You can play RE4 for hours and hours and never get sick of it. This is a testament to how this is one of the most solidly designed action titles ever produced. Is this the greatest game of all time? Well, I try to think of things I don't like about RE4 and almost nothing comes to mind. This is one of those games that's rich with detail and content. It's a lengthy campaign that knows all the right times to introduce something new to make the experience still feel fresh. It has a meaty post-game, a plethora of modes and unlockables. It's mechanically fine-tuned. It's a leading innovator that's still fun to play to this day. It's a story that will keep you entertained throughout. It's a magnificent game. An absolute era-defining game, lightning in a bottle, this one. It comes together so well that it's hard to imagine how much strife the team went through to reach this point. For me, it's pretty much flawless as far as gameplay is concerned. But all that's basically been said in the video. What does all this mean? Well, despite the fact that I don't tend to bring RE4 up much when it comes to discussing my favorite games, I now have this video to be a testament to how much I enjoy this game, how much I have enjoyed playing this game before and will continue to do so in the future. It's pretty much everything I look for in a game. So again, is it the greatest game of all time? To endure this long and be so iconic, I'd say the case can certainly be made. I think it's entirely fair that this game is included in those discussions. Now, Resident Evil 4 didn't just fundamentally change the third-person shooter genre with its controls, it of course changed the RE series as the classic formula from 1996 to 2002 was basically abandoned after this game was released. Truth be told, I've never actually played Resident Evil 5 and I've never got very far into Resident Evil 6. But shockingly, this is actually one of the most financially successful RE games ever made. To this day, the original 2009 release of RE5 on PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 is in the top 10 best-selling Capcom games, and you don't have to scroll down very far to find the PS4 and Xbox One remaster at number 33. A lot of people have played RE5, which surprised me when I first saw this list many years ago. At one point, this was the highest selling game in the series from one version, before RE2 Remake and RE7 overtook it and RE6 as the best selling ones. But before we get too lost in the sauce of sales data, I'm just trying to illustrate that RE5 is a very widely accessible game that millions of people have played in the last 15 years. It released to very positive reception from critics, but even they mentioned in their reviews that hardcore fans of the old RE games might not enjoy it as much, since it all but confirmed that the direction RE4 went in was now what the series was going to be. And I would say that prediction came true, at least going off my comments who believe that the action-heavy RE games were a mistake. But I'm down to give anything a chance, even if I thought RE5 would be mid. I was especially curious to try this game since the RE4 remake went out of its way to set up the plot of RE5, either to tie into the original or potentially tease a remake of the game, which has sparked a lot of discourse about the possibility of a remake. So in doing this retrospective on RE5, I wanted to see where I stood on that question, which will be discussed at the end. After all was said and done, what did I think of this game after trying it? Well, let's find out.
Resident Evil 5.
Chris Redfield is an agent of the Bioterrorism Security Assessment Alliance, or BSAA for short, and he's now been sent on a mission to a fictional location in West Africa to investigate the sale of a BOW and put a stop to it. Chris is joined by a woman named Sheva Alomar as she guides him through the region. Along the way, they discover that the people here have been infected by an enhanced version of the RE4 parasite called Las Plagas, turning the locals into the enemies you fight called Magini. Chris has to contend with that, and internally struggle with the supposed passing of his former partner Jill Valentine, and has to confront the past yet again as his former leader, Albert Wesker, is responsible for the latest disaster. Which is all you really need to know to get into this game properly. If you loved Resident Evil 4 like I do, then I feel you will at least like Resident Evil 5, which was more than the case for me. I remember saying in the video on RE4 that the game's combat system was very unique since it simultaneously grandfathered the modern action third-person shooter but also plays in a way that is very distinct from those later titles. In RE5 you have a system that is very similar. Chris uses a variety of weapons against hordes of enemies, and you use those weapons to hit critical points on enemies to get up close and do a melee attack, which gives you invincibility while you do it and can clear out crowds if you get overwhelmed. Though Chris is more about using his fists to deal massive blows to enemies, while Leon prefers agile kick attacks. Either way, it made for satisfying melee attacks. While you fight, the tension is increased because Chris cannot move while aiming, so aiming is a risk where missing one shot means your enemies have the chance to get closer to you and do some damage. This time around, critics thought the inability to move while aiming was more of a limitation than they did when reviewing RE4, but personally, I thought the mechanics of shooting in RE5 worked for all the same reasons as it did in the last game. I'm imagining that to people playing it at the time, RE5 looked like it was intentionally holding itself back when other shooters introduced consistent cover shooting mechanics and the ability to move while aiming. In some ways, the controls have improved for RE5 though. This game features full 360-degree movement on the analog stick, when RE4 was still using the classic tank controls from the older games, just with a third-person camera. This made RE5 feel pretty smooth to control when traversing through the areas, while also feeling familiar to players of RE4, as you still have the classic moves like the quick turn for an immediate 180-degree shift. But you'll have more mobility when moving backward and forward. Having said that, there were areas that did prefer how RE4 handled. For example, in the last game you could move the camera left and right while sprinting. It wasn't by a wide margin or anything, but it was useful for seeing things in Leon's peripheral vision that wouldn't be obvious by leaving the camera at its default position. In RE5, you can move the camera up and down while sprinting, but not left and right, and that really toyed with my muscle memory. I also wasn't a huge fan of the way the inventory screen worked. Games with a bunch of weapons have had many different ways to deal with this issue, and RE5 does it in the fashion I find least desirable. You can access your inventory with a press of a button, but it pops up in real time, which means you have to grab whatever you want while the action of the game is still ongoing. But you're frozen in place while doing something like asking Sheva to give you grenades or ammo, which can lead to you taking damage like it's Ratchet & Clank 1. This is faster, perhaps, than a game like RE4 where you had to stop the action entirely to look at the inventory, but I find that system more comfortable. I think a system like Ratchet & Clank 2 or Metal Gear Solid works where you pause the action to switch weapons, but the process is pretty fast. Although, when actually thinking about it, perhaps that wouldn't work for a multiplayer game, but alternatively, a real-time inventory screen can work, like The Last of Us, where you grab a whole assortment of gear while being on the move. I would be complaining a lot more about this had I not noticed something a few hours in that someone in the comments had already said before I finished saying this paragraph. Which is that I noticed that 4 inventory slots had directional inputs on them. Putting those items on those slots is how you quick swap weapons like it's Jak 2. which meant I didn't have too much of an issue with the inventory screen after a little bit of playtime, but I figured I would bring this up anyway because I don't really like the real-time frozen-in-place inventory system on principle, even though you can thankfully quick-swap weapons. But as I said a few moments ago, despite those nuances, I still think that if you love RE4, you'll find something to enjoy in RE5. You may prefer how RE5 does things I just listed out over RE4 or vice versa, which can be discussed, but RE5 is absolutely cut from the same cloth as RE4. Where it departs is in how the game fully drops the pretense of this series intending to be scary. I suppose this is also in the eyes of the beholder, as I've gone on record to say that I wasn't really scared of any of these games besides 2 Remake and 7. Those games actually gave me a really fun feeling of complete and utter dread while going through them the first time. There were jump scares that got me in the early games when I first played them, but largely I was more afraid of losing progress than the inherent fear factor of the games themselves. However, I've also said that not having played them when they were new was probably a factor. But it's still pretty clear this was supposed to be a very strong element of the game, as you would walk into the unknown with a small ammo pool and no idea how you were going to survive whatever was going to come your way. This was a consistent element throughout all of the classic RE games. In Resident Evil 4, that specific element is dropped since ammo is everywhere in that game, but I think RE4 still has a really tense atmosphere. Think back to that part after the village when you first rescue Ashley where it's pitch black and raining with thunder and lightning, and the lighting comes from torches lit across the area as enemies slowly emerge from the shadows. You don't fear running out of ammo, but it is a suspenseful atmosphere. RE5 is just a straight up action shooter, taking RE4's idea of frequent action set pieces and doubling down on it with car chases and other vehicle sections and pretty much non-stop combat. Only a couple of dedicated puzzle sections throughout the game. In fact, off the top of my head, the only puzzle in this game I can think of is this part where I had to redirect laser beams across 3 rooms in a row. I admittedly had an embarrassing death here at the end. I solved the third puzzle but didn't understand how to get through the lasers and died trying to just walk through it. You're supposed to move the laser back a bit so you could redirect it again on the other side. Oops. But besides that, you don't really do much in the way of puzzles besides finding keys to open doors, but I don't even know if that technically counts as a puzzle anyway. RE4 was like this too, and also had some of the most painfully obvious puzzle solutions in series history, but my point is that I thought RE5 wasn't really trying to scare you as much as it wanted to provide an action movie-like thrill ride, and to that end I thought it was successful. The game offers a bunch of set pieces with a decent amount of variety so that the campaign never gets boring. You'll have an enemy rush at the beginning, a chase from enemies, navigating a dark cave where one character uses the light and the other character fights, boss encounters with unique team strategies, chainsaw enemies, getting locked in a room with a mutant that's only weakness is on its back, and the list goes on. The only time I felt like this was a hindrance was when you had to do the on-rail shooting section. Moments like these are a pace killer because there's no way to skillfully make it go faster, you just sit there and shoot for a few minutes, and then the game relegates the El Gigante boss fight to this shooter setup, which is kind of a letdown compared to RE4. This was far more noticeable the second time I played it. But yeah, while RE5 fully dropped the notion of Resident Evil being a scary series with a slower pace and quiet atmosphere, I never felt like that was the main DNA of the Resi series. I've gone over it multiple times in the past, but what I think makes RE what it is can be summed up in 4 concepts: resource management, tension, exploration, and replayability. I think it's totally fair for a game in this series not to follow the exact formula of the classic games and still be considered a worthy part of the franchise if it still adheres to these core principles applied in whatever way best suits that game. I've said this about RE4, and I think that still holds up in RE5. I already covered tension because the combat pits you up against an army of enemies with a control system that locks you in place while aiming. But to look at the other pillars I laid out, in RE5 they all revolve around the partner mechanic. Each game with multiple protagonists has handled it slightly differently, but to put it simply, imagine the part in RE4 where Leon and Luis battle against a horde of enemies in the house. Only it lasts for the whole game, and Luis was his own character with his own inventory you had to manage. Chris is teamed up with Sheva throughout the entire story, and she's controlled by an AI in the single player. I was dreading this element of RE5 and had a fearful prediction that this would make the game more frustrating than it otherwise would be. In my first play session, I thought the game was kind of hard to get used to, especially since you get a big enemy encounter within about 10 to 20 minutes of gameplay. At that point, Chris nor Sheva had much ammo or weapons, so I got overwhelmed with it. But after a few hours, the system actually started clicking with me. I thought the partner system was designed compellingly. Again, effective resource management is the largest mechanical through line of the RE series, and this was a dynamic that kept my inventory at the front of my mind at all times. When you break boxes in RE5, you have to choose if you want to pick the item up as Chris or press a button and have Sheva pick it up and add it to her inventory. So throughout the campaign, you're constantly assessing your own inventory and combat preferences and what weapons and ammo Sheva might need to best support your playstyle. For example, I prefer to do more damage at a faster rate myself, so I made sure Chris always had a shotgun and a machine gun and other powerful weapons. I would use a sniper rifle if it was given to me, but then I would usually give it to Sheva when I was next able to because I noticed the AI, at least in my playthrough, tended to be much more conservative with ammo than I was, so I thought that Sheva getting rifle weapons and a basic handgun would complement my more aggressive playstyle. Since we both had handguns, I'd sometimes skip out on picking up handgun bullets since I knew Sheva was running low on them or out of them entirely. When upgrading the weapons, I usually focused on Chris's stuff, but I also thought it was important to give Sheva some upgrades to make her more powerful, and I'd also upgrade her weapon's max ammo count for a free refill of ammo so I could stick to collecting ammo for myself. Though on the subject of ammo refills, when I was playing this the second time in multiplayer, my friend told me that you can refill ammo in this game by combining it with the weapon in the inventory screen like the classic games, which is way faster than reloading. So you can save yourself money by not even bothering upgrading the reload speed. But I'm sure you get the point by now though, right? This partner dynamic in RE5 added a lot of strategy to the playthrough, and I really appreciated that. It also incentivized exploration, as you needed to go through as many nooks and crannies as possible to make sure you were collecting as much ammo as possible, finding all the treasures to sell, and using the money earned to buy more upgrades. This is what made the Marshlands portion so fun to play, as you visited all these different spots to grab the necessary collectibles, but also get into engaging combat scenarios and find cool secrets and useful items. This game removed the thing from RE4 where you could increase the value of treasure by combining them before the sale, as this game went with something simpler where you just find treasure and sell it. Whether that's an improvement or a downgrade is a matter of opinion. I can work with either one though, as the system in RE4 didn't really get utilized as much as it could have been, something I really preferred in the remake from last year. But all in all, I thought RE5 systems were pretty engaging. Though I do have some nitpicks. One is how I don't like the way the ammo exchange works in this game. Back in Resident Evil 0, which also had a partner system, you could share ammo in quantities of 5 rounds at a time or some number like that. I wish RE5 did something like that, because sometimes I'd want to give Sheva some of my ammo only to lose pretty much my entire stock of it. That made me more apprehensive about sharing ammo, to say the least. And this isn't regarding the partner system, but since I'm now talking about picking up items, I might as well touch on it. I don't like how items force you to stop and watch Chris pick them up off the ground. It only lasts like a second or two, but I just thought RE4 was faster, as you just mash through the item collection screen faster than this animation takes. And then other games like Uncharted just made these animations faster. But I'm getting sidetracked here. I want to use this as a moment to speak about the AI in this game. As I alluded to earlier, this is one of the more well-known / infamous elements of RE5, and in my experience of playing it on normal mode, I thought it was alright. I mentioned this earlier that the AI Sheva was pretty reserved in how often it would shoot, which I actually thought complemented my playstyle pretty well and didn't waste a lot of ammo. Then, whenever I was in trouble, I was rescued pretty quick, and most importantly, the AI was pretty reliable with rushing to heal me whenever I took a big hit. To the point where I automatically gave Sheva pretty much all the healing items I came across so I could use the space for more ammo and weapons. It just became a part of the strategy of the game. But obviously, the AI in this game has many dumb moments, like in Chapter 5-2, where we were doing this double button security door, and she just tried running through me for several seconds. Also, there would be times where the AI had weapons but just wouldn't fire them. I was in the final boss, and it would just not shoot Wesker because they only had the grenade launcher and didn't feel like taking the shot. Then, my friend pointed out to me that on professional difficulty especially, the AI just cannot keep up with the demands of the game if you're doing single player, which makes a lot of sense. But when playing on normal, I survived more than I even thought we would. Like in this cave section with a million liquor-type enemies. When Sheva started getting chased by them, I thought she was a goner, but then when we got cornered in a room full of them, I was just firing blindly, hoping to outlast the enemies, and somehow that did not result in my death. The only low point I had with RE5 was this Ouroboros boss fight in 5-2. In theory, it seemed pretty simple. Use fire to expose weak spots and blow it up. It even came with a rechargeable flamethrower in the back to use. But I don't know what happened, I spent over 30 minutes doing this and never won. Seems other players on the internet are talking about this too, so I have to imagine that there's something I missed, but just didn't know. So I did what one YouTube comment suggested, which was buy a rocket launcher and kill it in 2 seconds. That did the trick. But that low point was pretty hard to explain since I have no idea what went wrong, so that wasn't even the AI partner's fault. But in the event you do take a massive issue with how the partner mechanics work, luckily Resident Evil 5 is a fully functioning co-op mode that you can play online. For this, I enlisted the help of my friend Ruby of Blue, who has made many Resident Evil, Sonic, and Halo videos if you're interested. The link will be in the description. I actually asked him to do this playthrough when I was covering RE1 like 2 years ago, and now that time has finally arrived. When I was playing this game by myself, I could already tell how much more fun the game was going to be when I'm playing it with a friend who also knows their way around Resident Evil, because I thought the system of managing 2 inventories and relying on a partner during combat was really engaging, and that was when it was with a computer. With another person, it was exactly as enjoyable as I thought it was going to be. This adds a ton of replay value to the game as you get to experience it from another angle. In the single player, you play as Chris, and there are parts where the Sheva AI does things you don't. So as a result, I decided to let Ruby play as Chris, and I'd play as Sheva in the multiplayer, and through doing that, I got to explore those parts that Chris did not in the single player. You get to experience new content this way and play the game through a new lens. For example, the part in the marshland with the boat is more fun because now one player steers and the other one shoots. In the single player, I didn't pay much mind to the AI trying to shoot enemies while I was driving the boat. Now, the inventory management dynamic is made more interesting because when I'm playing the game with a computer, I'm using that AI as an extension of myself, giving it weapons and healing items to best support my gameplay. When it's with another person who has their own playstyle and weapon preferences, we have to manage that in real time. Also, both of us needed to keep healing items around to make sure nobody got caught in a jam while the other player couldn't help. That was important because when you're in the same area, you aren't tethered to the other player, so you can independently explore and fight until you need to be together to go to the next area. I have to say, there are very few multiplayer-driven games that I've ever really gotten into, and there are even fewer multiplayer modes in single-player games that I liked. So what I'm trying to say is that Resident Evil 5 is a game where, despite the hiccups the AI could cause, I enjoyed the single player and then the multiplayer in the game just as, if not more than the single player, allowing me to see the game from a whole new angle. Literally because Sheva is left-handed, which took me a minute to get used to. But like I was saying earlier, replayability is a core pillar of the RE game design, and I think there's a lot of value in playing it more than once in both single and multiplayer. And once you've done all that, there's other post-game content to sink your teeth into. The Mercenaries mode returns from previous games with a bunch of maps and unlockable characters as you survive against a horde of enemies and use item pickups to extend your time. You can even play as Rebecca and Barry from previous games. I highlight that because it was funny to me how Rebecca doesn't do any combat takedowns. She instead uses her newfound passion in pyrotechnics to deal with enemies. And in addition to the Mercenaries mode, you can play DLC levels that expand on the story, like the Lost in Nightmares mode, where you play as Chris and Jill trying to track down Spencer and Wesker before the events of the main story, and then the Desperate Escape level, where Jill and Joshua escape the plant while Chris and Sheva track down and defeat Wesker in the main story, setting up the part where Jill and Josh show up with a chopper for extraction. These were also good modes with the same strengths as the main game, and it was also really cool to see a Jill and Chris team up. Though on the note of story, I guess I haven't talked about it much thus far. This game had an entertaining plot. The stories of the RE games have never been super serious, but RE5 managed to keep me watching the cutscenes because of a few important things. First, the voice acting is consistently good in this. At their absolute best, previous games were entertaining in like a cheesy way, but more often than not just kinda got the job done. But I just think the characters in RE5 are well cast and do a good job with the delivery of the lines. Special mention to Roger Craig Smith as Chris, who's by far the best voice the character has ever had and probably ever will. Then the story holds your attention because the cutscenes are directed so well. Action scenes have a good mix of fast-paced hits and slow motion, the camera work and shots are great, and the motion capture is really convincing. But the production values are off the charts in RE5. Playing the game for the first time in 2024 didn't make me feel like I was playing some ancient, dated game. Of course, this is on PC, so I was playing at 4K and 60 FPS, not the original PS360 version, but I'm just saying that artistically, RE5 has a lot of appeal despite some lower res textures. Models are detailed and animations are fluid, the lighting is phenomenal, and the devs made sure every weapon and effect had some kick to it. The game has a distinct visual style thanks to its lighting filter effects. I'm sure some might point to the piss filter as a drawback to the game, but I think it's a strength. Sure, it's kind of goofy how, like in Breaking Bad, the second a character goes to a foreign country, the lighting gets deep fried, but in video games, I think this visual style makes RE5 stand out from other military action games that were especially prevalent at the time. It's something where you'll see it and know instantly that it's RE5 and not some other realistic military shooter game. However, I suppose the setting and its depiction warrant some extra discussion. As mentioned earlier in the script, RE5 takes place in a fictional part of Africa. If you know anything about this game, you already know I'm talking about the infamous incident where a trailer for the game was shown in 2007, and a journalist said that mowing down an army of Africans felt pretty racist. I only know about this because the gamers furiously complain about it to this day, but I never heard the original quote, so I figured I'd check it out. It was stated that the preview, which was admittedly not representation of the entire game, gave the author an uncomfortable feeling, stating that it's not inherently a problem, just a matter of execution. Reading up on this, it was pretty surprising to see just how much this blew up. Because at the end of the day, it was just one person's opinion on a trailer for a product that wasn't going to launch for another 2 years, so it wasn't even based on any thorough evidence, but an initial reaction. But in those 2 years afterwards, other journalists from pretty much every publication, even semi-related to video games, weighed in on it, curious to know if the game was in any way changed as a result of that original opinion, or if the character of Sheva was included because of it, when the answer was no. The game being passionately defended by Karen Dyer, who played Sheva, and similar sentiments were echoed by TJ Storm, who played Joshua, when the Associated Press interviewed them.
It's in Africa. It's been in Antarctica. It's been, I think, in Spain. It's been in the Midwest. It wasn't racist then. Why should it be racist now? It's in Africa. Have fun with the game. Play the game. There are Africans in Africa, but there's other people. You see, in the game, actually, I believe you see some Arabics, some Europeans. They're all running around. they're all in trouble, and they're all in the same boat.
It would be one thing if, they were shooting people who weren't infected or shooting people who weren't, part of this evil. But these are people that are, they have to defend themselves. They are what they are, Majini, infected individuals that are coming to hack you.
As I said, this blew the hell up, to the point where Glenn Bauman, a social anthropologist at the University of Kent, weighed in and said the allegation was silly, especially because of how RE5 has anti-colonial messaging baked into the story, as the villagers you fight are the unknowing victims of the villainous corporation doing experiments. But regardless, Capcom Japan knew they never wanted a scandal like this to ever happen again, so going forward, all games are going to be conceptualized alongside Capcom USA to specifically make sure that such a thing would probably never occur again, and it seems the results have been exactly that. Needless to say, if you ever see the gamers rage about how an RE5 remake is going to change everything to appease the mob of people calling the game racist, just know that it never really happened in the first place. A statement was made, and in the eyes of the people who worked on it and the general audience, it didn't really hold up to scrutiny once the game was out. So I doubt many of the enemies will be that different if they actually decided to remake RE5, but these are the same kinds of people who preemptively raged about Krauser getting cut from RE4 Remake because the dev team wanted to tear down masculinity in men, or whatever other ludicrous conspiracy these people rage about. That one didn't age well. I set out to research the subject after playing the game because I never really knew the details of the potential issue and wanted to experience it blindly. Yeah, I can agree there aren't really that many teeth to the argument. The only time I ever thought, the hell, to myself was when you had to battle tribal enemies jumping up and down and tossing spears and shit. But that's not to say tribes don't exist anymore, I just thought this was a particularly cartoony depiction. However, for the rest of the game, I really did just think it was as simple as this. The game takes place there, so that's what the enemies look like. It's about as insensitive as the original Resident Evil 4, which saw the enemies speaking Spanish in a South American dialect when it took place in Spain. This is to say, not a big deal, but it's definitely something that could be adjusted in a remake like RE4 Remake did for that very issue. But it certainly never brought down my experience with the game, as I thought the mechanics were really solid throughout and it came together in a pretty cool climax. The stories of these games were never trying to be the most complex or thought-provoking. I still thought RE5 was engaging as someone who has played and replayed all the previous games, and I imagine it was doubly so for fans who had been there since the beginning. RE5 is the first game to actually show Spencer and his death and give even more info on the origins of the Umbrella Corporation, and it also has a satisfying ending for the Chris vs. Wesker saga. A divisive element of Resident Evil 4 was how the game unceremoniously claimed that Umbrella went out of business sometime between the events of Code Veronica and RE4, despite the fact that RE1, 2, 3, CV, and 0 did so much to build up to some big confrontation with Umbrella. RE4 did this because the dev team just wanted to do something completely new with the enemies, which I can respect. But I like how RE5 takes that and runs with it, while also making sure the series' main villain gets a proper finale. In RE5, we see how other companies are filling the shoes left behind by Umbrella by making more vicious BOWs, and Wesker's at the center of it. Fitting that his final game is one starring Chris, because the rivalry between these two specifically was the one the games were building up to. Starting with that hilarious cutscene of RE1 when Chris laughed at the tyrant monster to Wesker's comedic disappointment. And then that origin story got redone really well in the remake. But then Wesker came back and got superpowers in CV, and Chris could barely get past him. You just wonder, how the heck is he possibly going to be beaten now? Well, this game answers that with a lot of flashy fight scenes and a huge climactic multi-stage boss battle. One that pays off Chris's arc in this game, as it turns out that Jill, the other character with a history with Wesker, seemingly died saving Chris the last time they fought with him, which makes Chris a little reluctant about the whole partner thing at the beginning of the story, but it's only teaming up with Sheva that allows Chris to win the day and also discover that Jill is still alive and under Wesker's mind control before Chris and Sheva save her. The actual final boss battle going completely nuts as Wesker has these huge arms that go flying all over the place, and Chris casually punches a boulder into the lava to give Sheva a platform at one point. I just wanted to bring that up because that was actually one of the only things I knew happened in this game before I played it, and now that I have the context, I can say it's actually funnier if you do. Because it isn't even some big moment that caps off the boss, it just happens completely matter-of-factly in the middle of it like it's not a big deal or totally outrageous, and I have to admire that fact. As in the end, the duo finishes Wesker with 2 rockets to the face as the game swiftly moves towards its conclusion. When thinking of Resident Evil 5 after writing the whole script, I must say, it's a lot more positive than I was expecting, even after playing it. Which got me thinking, what is my opinion of this game overall? Well, I thought it was really good. The game is polished and still holds up to this day in production values and gameplay. The game is just really damn good, and that was more than I thought I'd be saying since I genuinely predicted I was going to say the game was mid and move on. The game really pulled me in after the first 2 hours or so once I got used to its systems, but then once I realized that I greatly enjoyed RE5, showing that Resident Evil really is one of the most consistently good franchises ever made, I wondered how I would rank it among the others in the series. Since this is a franchise that houses some of my favorite games ever made, could it really compare? Well, I don't envision myself replaying this one like RE4 or RE2 Remake, or even some of the other ones I revisit often like the OG RE2 or the original Remake. That is thanks to the fact that I felt like RE5 was kinda long, so I don't even know if it's the most replayable thing out there, but I'm confident I'd have a good time with it if I did, since I felt like the game was pretty well designed and well made outside of a few moments where I had issues with the partner AI. There isn't a whole lot I can look to and be like, wow, what a misfire they had there. I just really liked it. Now, the discourse is heavily revolving around what an RE5 remake could be like and if such a thing would ever need to exist. As I've said in the past, what games deserve remakes isn't really up to me. There are some things I want to see more than others, but we're talking about the modern RE team. They've hit so many times now that I know whatever they do is probably going to be really good, so whether it's RE9, Code Veronica Remake, RE5, or RE1 again, or Zero even, is probably going to be awesome. But philosophically, I would say that RE5 Remake is probably the project I'd want to see the least. Code Veronica Remake's the one I want to see the most, if you're curious. But RE5 I just feel like is unnecessary. Not because there's nothing you can do with it to make the game even better or add to the mechanics, I just feel like the original still has a contemporary feeling to it. Especially in the cutscenes and voice acting department. But that's the thing. People, myself included, said that regarding the prospect of a Resident Evil 4 remake and dismissed the idea of an RE4 remake out of hand. When what we got was one of the highest rated games of last year that stands perfectly well alongside the original as a based action title, if you ask me. This is why I say I'm perfectly open to an RE5 remake, because I can see they can come up with some new ideas that expand on the original gameplay. I trust this dev team 100%, but since RE5 still feels contemporary in a way I don't even think RE4 does, I would just love to see a new game entirely, or a game like Code Veronica get that treatment, since it would be expanding on and improving a game with a lot of cool ideas and important story moments that is also one of the more difficult fixed camera games to get into. But I don't profess to know everything, let alone what's best for Resident Evil, I just know this. RE5 was pretty damn good and I'm sure I'll play it again, and that conclusion defied my expectations and I'm happy to say so. With that said, the next video will be about Resident Evil 6, which is a lot more infamous than RE5 ever was and is usually mentioned when the conversation of worst RE game, that counts, is brought up. Yeah, shock of all shocks, I thought Resident Evil 6 was terrible and easily the worst main series RE game. But the thing is, that genuinely saddens me to say, not because I was hoping to dive in here and be like, hot take, RE6 is a based action title, but because playing through RE6 I can see it's not your average crappy game. It's not some unfinished technical disaster like Superman 64 or Sonic 06, or some game that feels woefully undercooked and not very good with mysterious Sonic Frontiers footage playing over this voiceover. Instead, Resident Evil 6 just feels like a poorly conceived project. The kind of game that shot for the moon and executed on most everything it set out to do, but the goals they were shooting for were the issue. As I said in the previous video, Resident Evil 5 was the highest selling game in the series when it first released. It prioritized the action more than RE4 did, which already did that more than any previous RE game. Capcom's hope with RE6 was not only to continue to focus on what they thought made people resonate with Resident Evil 5, but to also attract the millions upon millions of people who played Call of Duty every year. And this isn't going to lead to some obnoxious anti-Call of Duty tangent. I've never played a single one of those games, and I'm sure I'd enjoy many of them if I ever sat down to try one. But still, chasing trends like this can lead to your game being the best execution of that idea, or it can just come off really desperate. But as Capcom said then, they believed the survival horror market was just too small to make big games for, so instead they wanted to pivot towards what the most popular thing at the time was, which was the military action shooter. That describes an overwhelming majority of popular games from the late 2000s and early 2010s. But as I have said numerous times in the past, I'm willing to give anything a shot and see how I feel about it, so I went into Resident Evil 6 hoping for the best.
Resident Evil 6.
In RE6, you don't have one campaign, or even two, but instead, 4. The first stars Leon Kennedy and new character, Agent Helena Harper. They're in the middle of a citywide outbreak of the C virus, and Helena knows that the National Security Advisor Derek Simmons is responsible and leads Leon to the secret lab for proof, as they are then blamed for it and travel to China to find, expose, and defeat Simmons. Chris Redfield is joined by Piers Nivens, one of Chris's BSAA comrades. Their unit was wiped out by being exposed to the virus, and Chris became a drunk afterward, being found by peers and brought back into the fight to find and stop the woman responsible, Ada Wong. Sherry Birkin, now a government agent, is tasked with locating Jake Mueller, who has antibodies for the C virus in the hopes of using that to produce a vaccine. And lastly, there's Ada Wong's campaign, where she has to get to the bottom of the ongoing conspiracy. These 4 campaigns are all happening at the same time, and the characters will occasionally cross paths or come into conflict. But the gameplay between the 4 stories is exactly the same, so that basic knowledge is all you really need to know to get into Resident Evil 6. I had a lot of issues with this game from the moment it started. Like this kind of slow prologue where Leon has to drag Helena to safety, followed by some explosions and chase scenes. But then, once I was actually into Leon's story properly, the first chapter was quite the learning curve. The game is all about the action, but things are pretty different from RE4 and even RE5. First thing I had to grapple with was how the camera is really zoomed in. I did get used to it after the first play session, but when I started, I just felt like the camera was too close, and that made the combat of the early game pretty difficult because zombies were all around me, and a lot of the time I couldn't see them coming. Or I'd be hit by a train or an ambulance I tried to avoid and wasn't able to. You do get used to it, but most of my deaths in RE6 came from Leon Chapter 1, where you need to get through the infected city. I was getting grabbed by enemies I couldn't see and got overwhelmed by the sheer volume of combat that's dumped into the first level. I actually didn't die that many times from then on, especially in the other campaigns when I got to grips with the gameplay. But there are still issues to deal with, like you don't really get much health in this game. Your character will have a few blocks of health and it runs out pretty fast. When you run out, you either need to wait for your partner to rescue you or wait out this bar on the bottom to get back into the action. Combine that feeling of not having much health with how often I was getting thrashed in the first Leon level, and I was given a poor first impression of this game. But to its credit, once you get a flow going, I think these combat mechanics are pretty satisfying at their best. Whatever character you play as will have access to a bunch of weapons, and you'll have a ton of options for engaging with enemies. Melee attacks used to be context sensitive, but in RE6 you can just attack any enemy with punches or kicks by pressing a button, and doing that will allow you to do cool combo attacks like a roundhouse kick as Leon or a backhand as Chris that clears enemies. Your ability to do melee attacks depends on the stamina gauge below your health bar. If it runs out, your character of choice will move slower and not be able to defend themselves as well. So you don't want to overuse melee attacks either. But your options don't stop there. You can quick-fire gun attacks to stun enemies and leave them open for melee attacks, and you have more mobility while shooting than ever before. Not only can you now move while aiming, you can also dive out of the way of any attack by rolling forward, diving back, sideways, or sliding into enemies, or rolling out of the way of attacks while shooting from the ground. Besides the Phantom Pain, I haven't played many games that handle shooting like this, and I think it can be a lot of fun to work with at times. I say at times for multiple reasons. The first of these reasons is that the enemy variety is pretty lacking in RE6. Leon's story brings zombies back into the RE series, and I thought these were the most fun enemies to fight as they're more mobile than the classic RE zombies and could even use weapons, but were still fun to fight with your various tools like combining guns with melee attacks. But once I started Chris's story, I was introduced to the Juavo enemies, which are combatants enhanced by the C virus. As Chris, Jake, and Ada, these guys make up an overwhelming majority of the enemies you'll face off against in Resident Evil 6. But the issue is I don't feel like they were fun to fight as they mostly blasted at you with guns from a distance, so many encounters in RE6 has become war of attrition shootouts. Games have made systems like that work just fine, but with the kind of awkward cover shooting mechanics and a campaign this long, it just gets old after a while. To get behind cover, you need to hold the aim button and then be near cover. It's a very odd system. At least coming from someone who's played a lot of Uncharted, but I can talk about those games again later. Like I said, room after room after room after room of fighting the same kinds of enemies and monsters just gets really tiring, which is the biggest issue I have with RE6. In the previous video, I didn't realize how important it was that I went over the 4 key pillars of RE game design, but I'm glad I did because I can use that to further explain why I think RE6 fails. I've gone on record to say that I don't think franchises need to play with the exact same gameplay and structure for all eternity to still be valid entries in that series. To recap, I think RE is not about fixed cameras and slower paced combat. I think Resident Evil is about resource management, tension, exploration, and replayability. Something like Resident Evil 1 will have resource management come from the game's finite supply of ammo and ink ribbons. Players are required to think about their supplies and how best to use them to get through the entire game. And tension arises from this because you don't want to die and have to go back to whenever your last save was, and you don't want to waste powerful weapons and ammo on regular enemies since you don't know when a boss is going to be around the corner. You're trapped in one location for the whole game and need to explore to find ways to progress further, and knowledge of how to do that makes replaying the game so much easier. That is how Resident Evil 1 handles those fundamentals. But in something like RE5, you manage resources by dividing your need for ammo alongside Sheva's, keeping your inventory at the top of your mind at all times. Tension arises as you can't move while aiming against hordes of enemies, so you want your shots to count. You explore nooks and crannies to find more ammo to stay in the fight longer and find treasure to sell so you can upgrade your weapons. Then you replay the game because it's a fast-paced and fun action game that rewards repeat runs with rankings and co-op. I believe these are both Resident Evil games. They're not very similar in how they play, but I believe those four principles make them feel like they're in the same series. At least, that's how I see it. When judging Resident Evil 6 from this angle, it's easy to see how it doesn't stack up. You really don't have to manage resources in this game because ammo is almost everywhere. This was true in RE4 and 5, but in RE4, you needed to consider how it was going to fit into your inventory, and in RE5, you needed to do the same and consider your partner's inventory as well. RE6 technically does have a cap on inventory, but whenever that came up, I was kind of surprised because it's usually not a factor, quickly resolved by merging some herbs together and reloading all your weapons. You fight enemies so often in RE6 that you'll rarely need to consider your inventory because it's constantly being used up. So you just keep going and going without much thought. The partner mechanic didn't amount to much in the single player of RE6 either, so it doesn't match RE5's resource management from this angle. Outside of specific set pieces, you never need to worry about your AI partners because they don't have a health bar or an ammo pool to manage. Instead, they offer support fire and revive you when you take a big hit. Some might prefer it to RE5 because it's simpler, but like I said last time, I liked the partner element of RE5 and thought it added depth to the gameplay. But while I'm here, I figured I'd mention how in the previous video I talked about Sheva being pretty reserved with shooting and how I liked that. According to the comments, Sheva has an attack mode and a cover mode, and I somehow overlooked that I was just sitting on cover mode for the entire game and never knew it was there or to switch to attack mode. But apparently that's how she gets into more trouble, so I'm glad I played it the way I did. But as I was saying, RE6 doesn't have that in-depth partner system, so it was a comparable downgrade to me, especially when you have to watch the AI character run really slowly to solve puzzles.
Roger.
What the hell are we doing here?
Are you okay?
Oh, shit! This is happening to me.
Not being rescued.
Or just look silly like this part of the Sherry Jake story.
I know what I'm doing.
I don't find RE6 tense because you're pretty well equipped and mobile against most threats, unless they just start getting in cheap shots like grabbing you from behind. But then checkpoints are pretty common and the game almost never has things designed to be scary, as it's much more interested in coming up with a variety of set pieces. You don't explore in RE6 because this is a linear hallway action game. Sometimes you have to move between different rooms to find things, but then the game will just tell you how to find them with waypoint markers on the screen and a button that tells you which way to go if you couldn't already tell. Sometimes you'll look around and find these skill points you spend on upgrades between chapters. However, I thought these upgrades were so overpriced that I just buffed my damage defense and my ability to escape grabs, and then that made the game so much easier that I didn't even need to change it. I collected as many of these as I could, but finding them just never felt rewarding. If anything, it was almost anticlimactic to open a chest and see these things inside them. Then I thought replayability wasn't high in this game either, though that is because of my personally not liking it. Replayability is pretty subjective, to be fair. The game does still have rankings for every chapter and for each difficulty as all 7 characters, so if you get invested in RE6, you have a lot of content to play. And there's also co-op and mercenaries and all that, but I found the main story so boring that I can't even fathom wanting to play it again. The biggest issue with RE6 for getting all these other elements that made this series what it was and putting all of its eggs in the action basket is that if they drop, you're left with nothing. When I played as Leon and Chris in RE6, I didn't really like the game much, but it wasn't until campaigns 3 and 4 when I just knew I didn't like RE6 at all because it's so long and so boring. The game has so many explosive set pieces one after another to keep the game as action-packed as possible, but this effort completely backfires and turns the game into a sea of repetitious boredom. You'll be flying through mines on a cart, getting dragged through the water by a mutant fish BOW, crashing a plane, jumping on train cars, piloting a fighter jet, driving through the streets shooting, outrunning a tank, being in another crashing plane, outrunning an avalanche in snowmobiles, getting chased in the streets while on a motorcycle, getting chased by a chopper, avoiding zombies on a boat, and piloting a helicopter, and the list goes on and on. You might say, doesn't that mean the game has a lot of variety? And in theory, yes. In practice, no. Half of these parts feel very random and out of place, and the other half are the same QuickTime events repeated again and again to where they all feel the same. Inside of a game that does almost nothing but have you shoot enemies in wave after wave. Since the action scenes are so samey, the visual spectacle falls flat and you start getting bored out of your mind. Doesn't help these action scenes overstay their welcome considerably. Chris put it best.
I've had enough of these stupid games.
The monotony really started to sink in when I got to the Jake and Sherry story. Leon and Chris only run into each other once, so both campaigns feel pretty distinct. But then Sherry and Jake run into Leon and Chris often, and I realized quickly that things are going to get even more repetitive. In Chris's story, I really didn't like this part where you had to avoid these giant BOWs while trying to destroy anti-aircraft fire. It was overly long and not that engaging. But since Sherry and Jake were here, you have to play the exact same sequence as them pound for pound how you did it in Chris's story. Same thing happened when Leon and Helena find Sherry and Jake being chased by this monster and have to team up to fight it. You do this twice. But then Ada crosses paths with all 6 of the other protagonists, which means you need to play many sequences again. Segments that felt mind-numbing the first time, only on repeat. And look, I've played a lot of games that feature a ton of action set pieces. Third-person action games are my favorite kind of game, after all. But to give examples of why RE6 fails with its own, I want to look at other games. Take the best Uncharted games, for example. You'll have explosive action set pieces that wouldn't be out of place in a blockbuster movie. But these sections are rewards and payoff for moments where you explore a city or a temple or solve a puzzle or two. They're not often complex brain teasers, but the slower paced bits make the action feel more rewarding. You do a 30-minute long train chase, and then you relax in a safe village and explore a mountain cave before ramping things up for the third act. This is just proper pacing. And you also see RE4 and 5 do this. In RE4, you aren't finding new set pieces every 2 seconds. You have slower paced bits where there's no music or anything. You just get to explore the village or the castle or wherever you're at. And then chapters will end with some massive firefight or a boss. RE6 gives you so much of this stuff at breakneck speed that you don't want it anymore. You've had enough. Not helped by the fact that this is the longest RE game by a wide margin. Each of the 4 campaigns took me roughly 5 hours to beat, which meant the game was about 20 hours long. I've played games much shorter than that, which I found really boring and tedious, and much longer games that I never get sick of. I don't have a preference for how long a game should or should not be, even if RE has historically been a series that ran on the shorter end of things. What I do have an issue with is how this game is not interesting enough to justify 20 hours of playtime, and you do have to play all 4 stories to understand the plot. One playthrough is not enough to grasp it. But after a certain point, you just don't want to play anymore because the game fails to provide substantive content besides endless shootouts and vapid set pieces loaded up with QuickTime events. It really was the Jake campaign that cemented it for me. When it's not doing segments you already did in earlier stories, it's totally original segments that are also a chore to play, like wandering through the snow following waypoints to find data sets, or getting captured and needing to escape, which is best done by avoiding conflict with enemies, but then remaining out of sight with these action-oriented controls and this zoomed-in camera was a nightmare. This campaign was the one that broke me. I found myself searching for 10 keys to get through a door, but then the game couldn't even make this a quiet moment as you get attacked by what felt like infinitely respawning enemies, only for a tank to crash through the door anyway and give chase. Which led to a series of other chases and battles. It's like trying to eat at an all-you-can-eat buffet well past the point of being full. It just brings the game from one I thought was below average into just being shit. So by the end of the Jake story and throughout the whole Ada campaign, which I did last, I was pretty much completely zoning out. Like, I was still playing the game, this is my footage and all, but it was the gaming equivalent of everything going in one ear and out the other. I don't know, it involved explosions, chase scenes, and QuickTime events, I can tell you that much. This is a shame because the 4 campaigns thing could have been used to make the game more varied. In fact, this was something they wanted to do way earlier in development. It was stated that they wanted each campaign to be a different kind of horror. Leon's campaign might have more of that gothic horror element, Chris's story might feel more like the horrors of war, and Jake's story was going to have that feeling of being stalked by a ferocious enemy, and Ada's story being more like the classic games. This is kind of something you can see in the final product. I mean, there was a part where Ada's story had fixed cameras while you dodged searchlights. That was a thing that happened. Leon's story opens on a callback to RE2's opening, and then you had to run through a cathedral that kind of reminds you of RE4. Chris's story does revolve around those themes, and Sherry and Jake get chased by this monster that was obviously a callback to Nemesis from Resident Evil 3. But it just doesn't land because somewhere in development the priority got shifted to the mindless action that takes up most of the game. This behemoth can't possibly compare to somebody like Nemesis because he only ever shows up for chase scenes and big shootouts. Like all the other bosses in this game, I can't even tell if I'm doing enough damage or not because they often don't react to attacks, so I just shoot until I inevitably win. But my larger point is just, the intent to make these stories feel distinct was clearly lost in the sauce somewhere in development as the priority shifted towards cramming in as many explosions as they could, and I just think the end product is a really boring game. So visually stimulating that it circles back around to being incredibly dull. Though when considering the visuals, the game is top of the line as far as industry standards from 2012 are concerned. I played the Steam version, so I played at 4K resolution and 60 frames per second, which is not how it ran in the original hardware, but still, the amount of visual variety, effects, lighting, and spectacle of the set pieces are enough for me to say this is a polished and good-looking game with fantastic production values. But artistically, I think this game looks really good, as I think all the characters are really well designed, and I think these are my favorite Leon designs of all time, if you couldn't clearly tell. But I just don't think this game is fun to play. At that point, the only thing that could carry the game is the story, but this is also a Resident Evil game, so that is not the case. All I really like to see in these games is characters I like, villains I hate, cool action, and perhaps an interesting underlying premise. RE6 has that, but I just mean it is not enough. To go over what I like, I thought Leon's story beginning with the president planning on letting the world know the truth of Raccoon City was kind of interesting. The world knew Umbrella's experiments were why it happened, but the larger story was kept a secret, and Leon questions if the truth getting out is a good idea, having been one of the few people to be there that day and survive. But the president is infected before he can reveal the truth, and Leon has to kill him, and then the whole city is turned into a Raccoon City redo with Leon on the front lines again. That was a cool opening, and wanting to stop Simmons from doing a new Raccoon City was a good motivation for him. Helena also had believable motivations and hate for Simmons as he experimented on her sister and frames the heroes for the outbreak. A villain you definitely love to hate. Chris becoming depressed after his unit is killed on his watch made sense, as they did a good job making the rookie likable before his death, and the flashback conveyed how great of a leader Chris was. But when thinking about it, Chris also being depressed and drunk over all the fighting is definitely believable. I mean, he's been fighting bioterror for like 15 years at this point. Umbrella is dead, Wesker is dead, yet he still has to keep fighting day in and day out. But Piers made for a good counterweight to Chris in this phase of his life.
Chris, we need to stay calm. After what she's done to us, how many of our men are dead because of that bitch? I'm right there with you, Captain. But your personal vendetta isn't gonna get us anywhere. If you hadn't been blinded by vengeance, we could have prevented some of those deaths. Shut up.
Though I must say, when Chris said he was gonna pass the mantle to Piers in the last level, I knew Piers was a dead man walking from then on. But he did go out in a cool fashion, infecting himself with the C virus to gain the power to save Chris. Seeing Sherry back as an adult was pretty neat, and it was an interesting choice to team her up with the newly introduced son of Wesker because their fathers were so tied to all the backstory of the RE games, so their kids being a force for good was a decent plotline. This game also revealing that Sherry has healing factor powers after she got the G-Virus vaccine in Resident Evil 2. Though on that note, I think it's funny how Sherry idolizes Leon and Claire both. That all but confirms the new remakes or some new timeline, because Remake Leon didn't even meet Sherry until the last 2 seconds of the game, when he and Claire worked together to save her in the original. But then the biggest narrative mystery in RE6 is what Ada Wong is up to. But you quickly realize in Chris's story that there are 2 Adas walking around, and then you kill the fake one in Ada's story. But then I feel like there isn't much of a conclusion here. There isn't some last story mode for clearing all 4 of them. Each group gets something they want or achieves their goals, and that's basically it. For example, Chris never learns there was a fake Ada, he just sees her die, tells Leon she's dead, and progresses to his final level. You just gotta play Leon and Ada's story to piece together what's actually going on. In some ways, it doesn't feel like the story gets much closure, it just sort of ends, if that makes any sense. But to be honest, I didn't really care as much about that as I did the long-ass final bosses. Leon's took me several minutes, as you need to stab zombies with this giant lightning rod so that when Simmons grabs a zombie he'll be electrocuted, and Chris needed to unload all his ammo into this abomination to do a QTE for 3 rounds, and then Sherry and Jake also need to do quick time events to kill their monster. Fun fact, when the boss fight ended I had thought to myself, okay, he's either staying dead or he's coming back for one last quick time event, and I was absolutely correct about that one, because they can't let the game end, obviously. and the end of Ada's story has you just repeat the end of Leon's campaign, just mostly from the helicopter. It was really boring. I had to think for a second about what even happened in Ada Chapter 5 when it was the thing I played the most recently, because all I was thinking was, thank goodness it was over, as you're unceremoniously greeted with the logo as the game ends. Though on that note, I can say, the meme is absolutely true. The RE6 logo totally looks like a giraffe getting a blowjob, and I chuckled every time I saw it pop up. But then, I stumbled on this article that claimed the Capcom social media rep on Facebook said the game's logo did kind of resemble a giraffe. But the image is dead. I need someone to confirm if that post actually exists. That would be so funny if it was true. But yeah, we're done here. Time for the conclusion. It has been a spell since I last played a game like this. Resident Evil 6 is not the worst game I've ever played, and hell, it's not even close. It isn't even a title I would think of if I was asked to name some of them. This is a totally playable, very polished game that is also boring. When I played it as Leon and most of my playthrough of Chris, I was willing to say I merely didn't enjoy it, but give it a pass. But as I have said, the more the game went on and on and on, the further it dropped on my shit list. Just a game where I felt nothing while playing it besides just hoping this next dull set piece was the last one of the level before I could move on to the next one and say I was one step closer to completing the game. I just don't think RE6 is fun enough to last 20 hours, and I don't think the game does anything outside of its core combat loop and set pieces to carry the experience. But that is why RE6 is as infamous as it is, so I guess you knew that already. I see people joke about what an RE6 remake might look like, since remakes are all the rage these days. But when thinking about it, ignoring how contemporary the game still feels, I don't really see how you could even remake this game without it just turning into a completely different game. I think this game's issues aren't with the execution of the mechanics, I just think all of that is buried at the core of the project. A misguided project that tried too hard to do too many things and it just fell flat, and then it really ruined the experience by going on for an eternity. It's just a game that barely feels like an RE game. But Capcom seemingly learned something from this game. In hindsight, I think RE6's history contains some things that were odd at the time, but you can clearly see were a sign of things to come for AAA games. Capcom projected a really high sales estimate for this game, but they lowered it a little bit when the mixed reviews came in. The game sold almost 5 million copies before 2012 was even over, and to this day, Resident Evil 6 on the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 is one of the highest selling Capcom games ever made, and yet it didn't bring in the profit hoped for. Something similar happened to Tomb Raider 2013, and now this seems to be a thing that happens pretty regularly where a big game will come out and the headlines will read about how amazing the sales are, breaking all the records, but staff will still be laid off because the game cost too much to make. Something that was really starting to become a thing in the early 2010s and is definitely an issue now. But as for Resident Evil, Capcom thought this was what Resident Evil 6 had to be because slower-paced survival horror games apparently didn't have that big of an audience anymore. But then, about 8 months later, The Last of Us was released on PS3 to rave reviews and high sales. Now, I'm not saying survival horror is that game's genre, but survival horror is also one of the most vague and poorly defined game genres ever. The point is, that game got people really invested in a third-person shooter game where you do take it slow and explore and encounter tense situations with a limited pool of resources. It wasn't those ideas that were out of style or anything like that. So maybe that, and the fact that RE6 wasn't the guaranteed success that Capcom thought it was going to be by chasing the military shooter audience, perhaps gave them pause for thought. Then the remasters of the RE1 Remake and RE0 in 2015 sold pretty damn well, better than those games even did when they originally came out in 2002. All factors that I think led to Resident Evil 7 in 2017 finally going back to the series' roots, to positive reception and massive sales, which just cemented that Resident Evil 6 was a project that was fundamentally flawed from the very beginning. Which is where Resident Evil 7 comes into the picture. A new game that was designed to go back to the survival horror roots of the RE series, but from a fresh new perspective. First person. You saw this game from the player character's POV. Perfect for the game's virtual reality compatibility. It also made the game a natural fit for live streamers and Let's Players, just how many horror games get their famous status these days. It even made me interested when it came out. Seeing a lot of buzz about how cool and scary RE7 was made me want to try it, but I never did so back when it came out. I didn't get into the series for a couple of years afterwards, but I've been over that story like a half a dozen times now. I've played RE7 before, but it's been a while, so I was looking forward to getting back into it now that I've played the entire series. Something that no doubt contributed to a lot of people getting into RE7 as their first entry in the series is that the story and premise make it easy to do so. You know, RE6 was this globe-trotting adventure with 7 protagonists, all with their own backstories related to various games in the series and competing motivations. It was a lot. But RE7 stars a brand new character, Ethan Winters. His wife disappeared 3 years ago, and then he gets a mysterious email from her saying that she's at the Baker residence in Dulvey, Louisiana, and Ethan takes off to find her. In the process, he gets captured by the Baker family and needs to fight through each one to escape. That's a premise anybody could grasp in 30 seconds and start playing. The first thing players in 2017 would take note of was how the game looked pretty good. The lighting and shadows looked great in RE7, and they still do. This was the first game Capcom released using the custom-developed RE engine, which stands for Reach for the Moon engine, not Resident Evil. But anyway, in RE7, those elements do still look good, but in many ways the visuals haven't aged the best. Long hair looks really bad in this game, and lower res textures are put in your face a lot, but to the game's credit, it is a full 60 frames per second on PS4, which was pretty rare last generation. Many big games with high production values tended to run at 30 frames per second, so RE7 wins in performance compared to other games at the time, and the RE engine would only continue to improve with each new game that used it. Looking to the gameplay, despite the change in perspective, the controls are pretty easy to get to grips with. You can still use the face buttons to access the inventory, you can still quick turn, aim, fire, and do all that good stuff. Essentially, all the modern RE games from this game onward have the same control scheme whether the game is first person or third person. And the game plays pretty similarly to previous entries, despite the shift in perspective. What is new compared to previous games is Ethan's defense. By pressing L1, Ethan will raise his arms, and if you time it right, you won't take damage from enemy attacks. Clearly, Ethan was getting dodge and parry training from Leon Kennedy off-screen, because he's a remarkably sturdy guy. Honestly, the most unintentionally funny part about RE7 and RE8 for me is Ethan's durability and never-ending will to live. Like, right at the start of RE7, Ethan's a totally normal dude taking falls like nothing, and then he gets his hand stabbed by a screwdriver and a knife, all from his wife who got possessed and tried to kill him like multiple times. By the time she grabs the chainsaw, I'd just be like, fuck it dude, let fate take me. I'm just saying, Ethan has spirit. But then he gets his hand cut off, and he just picks it up, adds it to the inventory, and then it gets stapled back on, fully functional by Zoe, Jack Baker's daughter who has yet to succumb to whatever has taken over the Baker family, as she and Ethan work together on a way out and a cure for Zoe and Mia. RE7 goes back to the classic RE formula in the purest sense because once Ethan gets captured by Jack Baker, you have to escape the main house and then explore the side house and then return to the main house before the final areas. The structure is very similar to Resident Evil 1 and the classic games that followed its mold. In order to escape, you need to explore the house and find keys to open locked doors that contain key items that will further allow you to explore the house and let you escape, which is exactly like RE1. Even calling back to some classic puzzles. This was one of the first RE games I played, so I got to the part where you needed to replace a real shotgun with a broken one to escape a room and thought nothing of it, but when I played RE1 for the first time, I realized that this was a callback to that puzzle from the first game. But then RE7 introduces new puzzles into the mix, like these perspective-based painting puzzles. You twist a statue around and make it look like whatever is in the painting. That's new for the series and feels in place for a first-person adventure game. RE7 succeeds in taking what was fantastic game design in 1996 and adapting it into a new setting while maintaining the same appeal. Even though it's entirely different gameplay from RE1, you still feel the same satisfaction from seeing a locked door with a scorpion icon, finding the scorpion key, and realizing you can finally open that door. It's basic, but it's timeless regardless of what gameplay is attached to it. RE7 also succeeded at the majority of the core pillars of the franchise that I laid out in my RE5 video, where I said that, to me, the core pillars of the series are resource management, tension, exploration, and replayability. Exploration is a given, I was just talking about that. The game uses the same structure of puzzles and unlocks as any of the classic RE games, so you'll more than get your fair share of exploration in this game. Whether that's puzzles, progression items, or little things to find like hidden upgrades, such as the steroids that boost your maximum health, or the antique coins that you use to unlock more steroids or a better handgun. You'll get to look around the Baker residence in full and are rewarded for your curiosity. Resource management is also a well-done part of RE7 because like the first couple Resi games, you won't have much ammo and the magazine capacity is not that high. Ethan only gets a couple of basic weapons in this, like a handgun, a shotgun, a makeshift flamethrower, and a grenade launcher, but not much else in a normal playthrough. Ammo is not in great supply, and so every shot counts as you face bugs and mold monsters. Tension naturally rises from that limited ammo pool, but RE7 also made being scary a part of its design. While exploring the Baker house, Jack will frequently terrorize you, and when I first played this game, I was scared shitless of him. Like, having this super strong farmer-type dude walking around the house talking about how he's gonna fuck you up was absolutely terrifying.
and avoiding his line of sight always felt like the most tense shit I'd ever played up to that point. This game made the stalker enemy a recurring part of the RE series. It had been done before, but following this game, almost every single one had an equivalent, since on the first playthrough it can really get to you. Getting caught by him was scary, and so were the bonkers scripted sequences and boss fights. The first boss with Jack was in the garage, and it was nuts. It's the one where he kills a cop, and you learn that Jack is seemingly invincible and immortal. But along the way, you grab the keys to this car and try to run him over, but you gotta do it fast, or else he's gonna grab the keys and try to run you over. He's an entertaining enemy to have in the game, and that fact holds up to scrutiny on my second playthrough. The game puts scares in your face like no other RE game, and I think part of why they did that, beyond the rise of streamer culture, was the game's usage of the PlayStation VR headset. But RE7 is perfectly normal to play without VR, so don't worry if you don't have it though, because honestly, I don't think you're missing much. I happen to own a used PSVR headset from the Batman Arkham spin-off video I made last summer, so I figured I'd whip out the headset and try RE7. Which first reminded me of just how many cords there are for this thing, and how many things needed to be plugged in at once. It's a very cumbersome setup. But I honestly had more fun with this game and got more tension out of playing it without VR. Unlike, say, Resident Evil 4 Oculus, which I played, this wasn't really that immersive. You put the headset on, but you still play the game with the controller, so you're looking around as Ethan with the headset, but it doesn't really feel that different from using a regular screen and an analog stick to control the camera. Unlike RE4 VR, where you run around the game world and reload your weapons like you're actually in the game. It's neat to use the headset and hear the audio through the headphones, but the experience isn't that different whether you use one or not. And I imagine most people who played didn't use VR, so it's a good thing the game design still works whether you use it or not. But yeah, I was talking about the core pillars of RE, and unfortunately RE7 stumbles at the final one, and it's a pretty big one: replay value. Now, RE7 has much of the same appeal in replaying it as other games in this series. You know, you see your stats at the end of the game, such as how many times you died and how long it took you to beat the game. Going back through it a second time, you can be better at the game and get through it faster knowing puzzle solutions and such. Just the same as any other RE game. On your first playthrough, you'll need to watch this scary videotape of a ghost hunting show looking through the house to find out there's a switch to a secret passage in the fireplace. The tape ends with them dying, of course. But if you already know that, you can just pull the switch without watching the tape. So I'm saying RE7 has qualities that make it a replayable game, especially once you unlock Madhouse mode. This sets the enemy AI to as hard as possible and you can't regain health automatically, you can only use healing items. It also only allows you to save if you have a cassette tape in your inventory. Item locations are remixed to be more complex, there are more upgrades but they're harder to find, all stuff that makes the game more challenging to beat. Though I didn't get very far in this because I got killed by Mia in the opening section twice and decided to cease playing. And the reason for that is because of the biggest reason why I wouldn't rush into replaying RE7 in general. This game has unskippable cutscenes, one of the cardinal sins of game design, especially in a game geared towards replayability. You know, RE1 and 2 had unskippable cutscenes, but I feel more forgiving of that because they're way older games and because the scenes weren't that long or that numerous. In RE7, a boss fight will begin with a cutscene, and if you die, you have to just keep watching it repeatedly before you get to do it again. Before fighting Mia, you've got to walk down the stairs and get through a whole scene of her launching you into the wall and all that. I died during the first Jack Baker fight and had to watch him kill the cop in the garage like 3 times, and died during the Marguerite Baker fight and had to see her crash through the window a couple of times too. I replay games trying to get through them quickly and efficiently, and watching the same cutscenes again just tends to get in the way of that. I think RE7, for me, is a better experience when it's fresh. Like I said, I haven't played this in like 4 years, so while I remembered much of it, it still felt new and tense in terms of horror. This is how I think the game is best enjoyed, since the story will feel new enough to where I wasn't bothered by watching the cutscenes, but I would be if I was trying to become a really good RE7 player. And there are other reasons I don't think this is the most replayable game in the series beyond the cutscenes, like how the intro is long. Before you get to explore the Baker house, you've got to do the whole Finding Mia sequence, which takes about 20 minutes if you know what you're doing, but is pretty one-note and scripted. And then when it comes to the rest of the game past the Baker house, it put in perspective how I think RE7 peaks pretty early. I've said this in many Resi videos, but most classic-styled RE games are the best at the beginning. The opening levels are usually better than the others. Think of how the Spencer Mansion or the RPD were the most layered and complex areas in RE1 and 2 compared to their far less detailed later levels. RE3 managed to avoid that by coming up with several smaller levels you play throughout the game. Even in the games with better opening levels than later ones, it wasn't to say that the later ones weren't good, just that the first one was the best. In RE7, the Baker residence is the best level, but it's also not really gonna light the world on fire, you know? It's a good Resident Evil level, but the puzzles and solutions aren't particularly mind-blowing if you've played the previous games, so I don't think this level is great enough to where it makes up for how the side house, the second area with Marguerite Baker, is short and straightforward compared to the opening. It doesn't have that many rooms and is pretty linear for most of it. Then, the trip back to the house is far shorter than the revisit to the Spencer Mansion in RE1. You do it to find the keys needed to get into Lucas Baker's party, where he's holding Zoe and Mia hostage. Most of this section is pretty scripted and linear too, but the puzzle at the end really stands out and shows why this game is best played relatively blind. Lucas is a twisted fuck, so you have to solve this crazy puzzle where you need to put a lit candle on a birthday cake. But the doorway of the room the cake is in has a pipe above it that will automatically drop water if you go through it, putting the flame out. It took me a few minutes to solve this. It works by taking both the candle and removing the winding key from this barrel that then drops a bunch of oil on the floor. The valve to stop the water is behind a word passcode lock. Getting to it requires putting the winding key inside this clown doll that will write the word loser into Ethan's arm, which is the passcode to the door. Once you stop the water, you can put the lit candle on the cake, but that triggers an explosion that lights the oil on fire and you burn to death. Although that's only half the puzzle. There's a lot more to it than that because it took me like 14 minutes to solve this whole thing because of how many moving pieces and steps were involved. But again, my point here is that RE7 has a lot of cool and memorable moments that I felt were only special the first time, and in this case, my first time playing the game in almost half a decade. After that Lucas section, you need to fight Jack Baker in an evolved form, shooting his various eyes from above and below him. I died to this once, but it's a manageable fight, especially if you were reserved with ammo up to this point. Ethan had given Zoe the materials to create a serum to save both her and Mia from the mold brain virus that infected the rest of the family, but in the fight, Ethan used one of them on Jack, so you have to choose either Mia or Zoe. I just went with Mia in both of my playthroughs because this just seemed like what Ethan would do, but that's also the canon ending, so there's that too. To be honest, when I first played this, I thought it was about to end and that Jack was the final boss, but when you make this choice and escape with Mia, RE7 becomes an almost completely different game. Mia and Ethan get attacked on the boat ride out and find themselves at a shipwreck. You're playing as Mia now, and this is when the player learns the truth. At the Baker house, you'd occasionally run into an old woman who you assumed was the grandma or something, but a little girl also showed up at the side house. Her name was Evelyn, and they're the same person. Mia was actually a researcher for some shady project on a tanker in the ocean. She was lying to Ethan about her job, but a flashback shows what happened the day of the shipwreck, which caused Mia's disappearance from Ethan's life. Evelyn is this little girl with accelerated aging that they kept experimenting on, as she has this psychic power and projects things into people's minds. For reasons that keep eluding the researchers, what she keeps projecting into people is that they are her parents, because all she wants is a family. But she's also unstable because she throws up this substance that creates the mold monsters that Ethan fought at the Baker house. So you take control of Mia trying to find Evelyn. It was funny when I started this section because Mia just was carrying a gun. It was a complete left turn that I never saw coming. Mia and her research partner can't control Evelyn as she causes a shipwreck that kills most of the people on board. Jack Baker found the wrecked tanker alongside Evelyn and Mia, and he took them in thinking nothing was wrong with them. But Evelyn proceeded to corrupt the entire Baker family, as confirmed in a vision Ethan gets from Jack saying they aren't killers or bad people, they just weren't in control of their actions. Evelyn was in their minds, making them into something else. While at the Baker house for 3 years, Mia was going in and out of being under Evelyn's control, which was bad for her because she wanted Mia to be her mom more than anyone else. So Evelyn was the one who got Mia to email Ethan her location, thinking that if she got Ethan under her control, they could be her parents. This backfired because neither Ethan nor Mia gave in to her effect. Learning what was going on in RE7 at the end was interesting. Like I said, I didn't see the part where you play a flashback as Mia with a gun coming. You learn other facts like how Lucas Baker was actually not under Evelyn's control, he's just a fucked up freak, and this gave him the perfect cover. He exchanged secrets about Evelyn's power with some outside group. The fact that he was always this way was kind of foreshadowed when you get into his childhood bedroom and read a letter about how he killed a kid who made fun of him by locking him in the attic. So story-wise, this final chapter illuminated many things. But on the game design side of things, the endgame of RE7 slows the pace down to an absolute crawl. The Mia flashback portion was long, and then the portion in the present was a bit difficult to get through since enemies are in abundance and you don't have that many supplies to deal with them. The whole boat sequence was just overlong, and I didn't have a lot of fun with it. I must remind, final levels in RE are usually never that spectacular, but this one especially was kinda eh. When you retake control of Ethan, I was ready for the game to end, so I was running past most enemies, and then the final encounter with Evelyn isn't much to write home about either. You counter some mind waves, hit her with the serum, and then she turns into a monster and that gets defeated pretty easily, and thus, the game is over. It had no connection to the larger series until the very end when Chris Redfield and his crew arrived to clean up the mess. Only, Chris has a totally different voice and face than when players last saw him, but that's to be expected of the RE series now.
I'm Redfield. I'm glad we found you.
The story continues in the DLC. You play as Chris chasing and killing Lucas in the Not a Hero DLC. Chris plays similarly to Ethan, only he's got more equipment and can punch through enemies in a highly satisfying fashion. There were moments here where I died doing stupid stuff, like when I walked into a dark room with no night vision goggles, and of course I got blown up. But overall, I'd say it was a good DLC. I guess I just liked playing as Chris again, and it has many tense moments like when you're trapped in a soon-to-be exploding tube. I enjoyed this one. The story then concludes in the End of Zoe DLC, where you play as Jack Baker's brother, Joe, trying to save Zoe before she becomes corrupted and dies. This part was fun because he doesn't even have any weapons, you just barehand everything and it was pretty cool. The main antagonist is Jack's final form that Joe puts out of its misery. The ending sees Chris help Zoe because Ethan asked him to do so, which ties up all the loose ends of the story. The regular ending is just Ethan and Mia escaping with Chris and crew and getting to start over, which is a fittingly low-key ending for a low-key adventure.
Mia and I weren't the only victims here. So were the Bakers. It was that thing, Evelyn, who made them that way. But now Evelyn's dead. And these guys are here to clean up the mess. I had just come to terms with losing Mia. But now she's back and wants to start over. Put all this behind us. Maybe this is where the next door opens.
But at the end of the day, I feel as though this script makes it seem like I don't like RE7, or at least don't think it's that great, which is not the case. Resident Evil 7 is a good game. I think it's scary, it's atmospheric, it's tense, and most importantly, it was fresh. If you play through the Resident Evil series, it's a much-needed shock to the system. RE became one of those long-running franchises that kept piling on more story and lore and superpowers and stuff that it reached a boiling point with Resident Evil 6. A game like 7 was exactly what the series needed. It goes back to the series' roots of exploring an evil residence like the first game. It cleverly brings back timeless game design with the structure and puzzles and such, and adapts it in a whole new way that was never before seen in the Resident Evil series and produced a really memorable experience. RE7 got the reception and sales it deserved. I think it's a game well worth playing and experiencing. Jack Baker has well-deserved status as an iconic gaming villain because getting chased by him on your first playthrough is an experience you won't soon forget. I think RE7 is great in many ways. The reason the video got kind of critical about it was because of how, on the replay, I don't think it's the best the series had ever done. RE7 pretty much got everything right. I just think that games like RE1 and 2 and 3 and Remake have superior level design and pacing, and then games like RE4 are just more fun than RE7. And then, I think later games like the RE2 and 4 remakes are more polished and enjoyable than what RE7 had to offer. I think it's a strong game, well worth playing, but when analyzing it and comparing it to other RE games, it doesn't execute the ideas as well as some of the others that came before or after. However, it was a well-needed game that kicked off the modern era of RE. Balancing ideas both old and new and doing it with this level of success is very commendable. They really pulled off something seemingly impossible in terms of pleasing old fans and bringing in new ones. So I really respect RE7 and think it's a good game. I don't plan on replaying it much because of how it peaks early and has a slow endgame and doesn't let you skip cutscenes. But hey, with that said, the designers had the ability to improve upon RE7 with RE8, or Resident Evil Village, which came out 4 years later. One of the perks of being a Resident Evil fan is that you get new content fairly regularly. Case in point, I got into this series when I finally got Resident Evil 4 off my backlog in 2020, which simultaneously feels like yesterday and a really long time ago. But yeah, I got into that game and played the RE2 remake, which I also loved. Then the RE3 remake had only just been released at that time, but right as I got into the games, the next one was announced. Resident Evil Village, or Resident Evil 8, or RE8, but regardless, the game was coming out in the spring of 2021. Resident Evil is a mostly yearly franchise at this point, so even if a game is kind of a letdown, the sting is never so bad because another one will be released right after. By the time RE8 came out, I had played enough games to where I considered myself a fan, so I pre-ordered it on Steam and played it the day it came out. I binged the whole thing in a single day, and it took me about 11 hours to get through. But then, despite the RE series being geared around replay value, I never touched Resident Evil Village again, not even when the DLC came out over a year later. I thought the game was good, but I didn't feel a strong urge to revisit it. But that's the exciting thing about this video. Now it's been almost 4 years since Resi 8 came out, and I can play it again and see how I feel about it. The game still follows Ethan Winters from Resident Evil 7. After Chris Redfield and crew rescued Ethan and Mia Winters from the Baker residence, they were placed in this witness protection setup because of the mold in their systems, and because of the knowledge Mia has from her research that she was doing before getting trapped at the Baker house. In that time, they had a daughter, Rose, who's 6 months old. But one day, Chris busts through the door and shoots Mia dead, takes Rose, and has Ethan knocked out and captured as well. Ethan wakes up in the middle of some snowy woods and finds himself in a nuttier setup than the Baker house. Wherever he is, it's a domain ruled by a woman called Mother Miranda who has taken Rose hostage for some kind of ritualistic purpose, and Ethan will stop at nothing to rescue her. But along the way, he has to fight against these monstrous servants of Miranda, Lady Dimitrescu, Donna Beneviento, Moreau, and Carl Heisenberg, which is everything you need to know to get into Resident Evil Village. Playing RE7 and 8 back-to-back really shows how much of a visual leap this game was from the previous one. While Village was released on PS4, it was designed for current-gen hardware, and that visual bump is noticeable. RE8 still uses the RE engine designed for the last game, but in execution, things like textures and hair are much higher quality. The game looks dazzling in every single area you explore, though, despite owning Village on PS5, I was playing on PC for this video for the maximum quality graphics. In hindsight, I don't know why I played the PS4 version of RE7 for that video. If I played it on PC, I probably would have felt a lot better about many of the game's visuals, like the low-res textures, but alas. Like RE7, Village has kind of a long opening. My issue with the opening segment of the last game was that it was pretty scripted and linear despite going on for like a half hour. In RE8, the intro does have bits that feel linear and scripted. The first bit of gameplay is at Ethan's house, putting Rose to bed. Pretty simple. But then you have to run through the dark woods for a bit and explore the empty village. In this moment, I felt like the intro was the same, or honestly slightly worse than RE7, however it does pick up. There's a big firefight between Ethan and these monsters that are loose in the village. It's naturally tense to be outnumbered, fighting impossible odds.
It's perfect!
And then there's your Sly Cooper reference of the day. In this combat section, I first saw that Ethan is more proficient in countering attacks than he was in the last game. Now, if you block an attack with the right timing, Ethan can push the enemy back and leave them dazed for a couple seconds, giving you an easy target to shoot. While I think the intro of RE8 is too long, especially once Ethan's trying to help these survivors in a burning building, I see the vision here in the opening combat section at least. It draws a lot of inspiration from the opening of Resident Evil 4, where you explored the isolated area for a bit and then got into a fight against an army of hostiles. But then, Resi 8 takes a lot of inspiration from RE4. That was just the beginning. Once you really start to get going with the game, you'll see how. You come across a merchant, the Duke, who sells Ethan weapons and has a shop system where you can sell treasure in exchange for currency that you use to buy gear from him or upgrade your weapons. It's pretty identical to the system from RE4. Though this merchant at least has the courtesy to sell Ethan ammo when Leon was screwed in that respect. There are other new elements to the merchant system though, like how he sells formulas for crafting your own ammo, which was not in RE4, nor was the food system where you can hunt for food and craft recipes with the Duke to achieve benefits like increased health and such. The inventory screen is also very reminiscent of RE4 though. It's a grid where different items take up differing amounts of space, and you need to manage how much space each thing takes up, and throughout the game the Duke will sell you increased inventory space. Though, unlike Resident Evil 4, I almost never had a space problem in Village, and I was hoarding ammo and first aid like it was nobody's business. In hindsight, it's interesting to replay RE8 and see how much of it was inspired by the design choices from RE4, when the RE4 remake was also in development and was the next game, and was a perfectly faithful remake to the design from that game, even incorporating systems from RE8 like buying ammo crafting materials from the merchant. I say it's interesting because Resident Evil inventory and shop systems being done like RE4 isn't the norm. RE8 was the first one to do it, and then the RE4 remake was the next game. I mean, RE5 kind of had RE4's weapon shop system, but the inventory was very different in that game, as I went into in the RE5 video. But anyway, like I was saying, I never had an issue with the inventory space in this game, so I don't think it's as well handled as RE4, or RE4's remake even, but that isn't a knock on RE8, because the way this game forges its own identity more than makes up for the difference in the ways in which its RE4-inspired systems aren't as good as that game. Because RE8 takes elements and ideas from RE4, it still mixes it into a game that is very much a sequel to RE7, a game that was trying to take ideas from the oldest Resi games and remixing them in a new way. So, with that said, I'll now begin my usual assessment on how I think RE8 handles what I believe to be the core pillars of Resident Evil. First, resource management. Despite the Duke selling ammo in RE8, you'll never be overflowing with them because enemies have a lot of health in this game and can sway around kinda quick, making them difficult targets. You don't want to waste your shots and all that. As I have said, you can craft ammo in this game, and so when you get the materials, you need to put thought into what ammo you want and what will best benefit you in the moment and hopefully later on. The nature of the inventory screen also gets you thinking about what resources you have and don't have and want to find/make space for. In the tension category, it is as simple as this. RE8's enemies are quite ferocious and deal a lot of damage. They give you reason to be afraid of them given your limited ammo and magazine capacity. Incentivizing hunting for food to upgrade Ethan and looking for treasure to upgrade your weapons. The exploration in the main levels is consistent with RE7 where it adopts design from the classic games. You'll be in Lady D's castle and need to find the right key to get into this room and solve that puzzle to find that core item or weapon, which further allows you to explore. This element is the same as it always has been in every RE game designed like this. I especially think this game wins in the exploration category because of how the things you find in the levels will allow you to explore the main village, connecting them, and then you get secret treasures and hidden weapons for it. I only found a grenade launcher by looking around the village and finding it in a secret chest. It's well worth the repeat visits. In the main village, you'll also find super tough to beat wolf enemies that, upon defeat, drop these crystals that are worth tens of thousands of in-game currency at the merchant shop, thus making you even more powerful as you can upgrade your weapons and buy new ones. So RE8 brings a lot to the table in the exploration category. Then the replayability is the same as most RE games. You get timed, and so there's a reason to replay the game and see how fast you can go when you know all the secrets. It also refines RE7's gameplay by letting you skip cutscenes. Thank goodness, because that was by far the worst thing about RE7. But then, while playing RE8, I had an observation that made both RE7 and 8 make a lot more sense to me. In the previous video, I had said that one of the issues I had with 7 was that the game peaked really early. The Baker House was the only level in the game I thought was really good, even if it wasn't the best the series had ever done. While most RE games have their best levels at the start, RE7 was unique in how much weaker I thought the later areas were. To the point where if I played RE7 again, I'm not even sure I'd bother playing it past the final Jack Baker boss because of how boring the endgame was. But what I realized with RE8 was that these two games are designed kind of like a series of haunted houses, as in relatively guided scares with frequent events designed to shock you on the first runaround, with some light exploration and puzzles on the way through. I just feel like these two games are the best when played blind, or relatively blind compared to other games in the series that are fun and scary the first time but even more rewarding on the revisit. But RE8 just executes much better than RE7 though. I can explain all this by going through the 4 levels. As established earlier, Lady D's castle is your typical Resi level in terms of progression and structure. But I don't think the focus of this area or the Baker House in 7 was purely on the puzzles and exploration. That, to me, feels secondary to what these games were actually about, the thrills of scary encounters. Because while I played this level, I felt like there was a lot of start and stop. Lady Dimitrescu has 3 daughters. She and the daughters will try and pursue and kill Ethan. So you'd go through a few rooms, nab something you need, and then be thrust into a boss fight or a chase sequence. It kinda got in the way of having a purely atmospheric or exploratory experience. But I feel like that's meant to be a feature and not a bug. It's undeniable that the terrified reactions players had to Jack Baker in RE7 and Mr. X in the RE2 remake had an effect on how they designed these games. Lady Dimitrescu is this game's iconic stalker villain, so the level routinely stops you to make you see how scary she is. And I don't really mind.
What the hell do... You ungrateful, selfish wretch! You come into my house! You lay your filthy man hands on my daughters! And now you even try to steal my property! Damn!
Rest while you can, because I will hunt you, and I will break you!
On the one hand, yes, the level isn't designed like my favorite RE areas because of the start and stop, but it's also well paced enough that you do get that satisfaction out of the puzzles and exploration while also being forced into set pieces, unlike, say, the RE3 remake, which goes way too far in that direction. But ultimately, I believe I was able to enjoy this opening stage because of how I haven't played this in almost 4 years, so fighting with Lady D and her daughters in somewhat scripted sequences can still feel fresh. Where RE8 really improves on 7 is the later levels. The second level with Donna Beneviento is what a lot of people seem to point to as an example of how the replay value of Village is diminished by its approach to horror design. You first solve this really long puzzle with a doll meant to look like Mia. This I thought was satisfying enough and would be fine to speed through on a second playthrough, but the issue comes with this second half where Ethan gets chased by a fucking horrifying fetus baby monster thing. There's one solution here: you get chased and have to hide under the bed and wait for it not to see you. This is game design geared around the first playthrough because on repeat runs you know exactly what to do and have to just do it the same way. But to be fair, I think this thing is deadass the scariest RE monster. Like, I had to look away from the screen whenever it was near me, but that's in the eye of the beholder. Once more, I had a really tense go around in this area because I haven't played it in a long time. This is where I really accepted that perhaps this is just how it was meant to be enjoyed, rather than saying it's a flaw because it's not my ideal RE setup like I did in the previous video. Though, in regard to the third level, I think the word level is doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence. This part's pretty basic. You get chased by a fish monster for a bit and have to solve some switch puzzles along the way before getting into a fight with Moreau. But I thought the boss fight was pretty good, and I think all the bosses in RE8 are good. They have a mix of scale and scope and strategy and resource management and all that good shit. But what sealed the deal with this game executing this design model better than RE7 was the last major level, Heisenberg's Factory. But before I even talk about it, I have to say that thanks to Breaking Bad memes, I can't hear the word Heisenberg without laughing. It just makes me think of Walter White tearing it up on Rainbow Road. Anyway, a level like Heisenberg's Factory is something RE7 really could have used to boost my experience with the game. Because after the good first area, the game just got more linear and restricted as it went along. In RE8, you have a good first level and 2 linear set-piece oriented ones after, but then the final major area is the biggest one in the game. The factory is a multi-floored labyrinth filled with deadly machinery and tough enemies. To get through it, you're gonna have to know the map and remember where things are in relation to what floor you're on, because you'll occasionally need to go up and down to solve everything and escape. It took me a really long time to beat it in 2021, and even now it took me like an hour. It's actually one of the more complex later RE levels, and is one of the very few examples in this series where one of the final areas is a highlight rather than kind of a formality. So in summary, I think RE7 and 8 are at their most fun when you play them blind, but RE8 wins with significantly better levels. Once you reach the top, Ethan gets sent all the way back down by Heisenberg, which is a real blow to the player until you run into Chris Redfield again, which gives me a chance to talk about this game's story some more, which is unfortunately not that much of a complimentary segue when talking about this game's version of Chris. For reasons I can explain later, I enjoyed a lot about the story of Resident Evil Village, but the one thing that hangs over everything is that Chris Redfield's a fucking idiot in RE8. But the issue is that the story needs that in order for it to happen. Like, they wanted some mysterious marketing where, ooh, Chris is evil in this game. But it just makes no sense. So, as I said up top, Chris busts into Ethan's house and shoots Mia dead, takes Rose by force, and has Ethan knocked out. To cut to the chase, it turns out that Mother Miranda captured Mia some time ago and used her powers to take her place so that she could get close to Rose, pretending to be Rose's mother so that she could form a bond with Rose before taking the baby and using her in the ritual. Once Chris found out about this, he tried to kill Miranda. But then, why would he go about it like this? When he finally explains it to Ethan, he's like, "You seriously think I'd kill Mia?" I mean, yeah, that's what it looked like. And then he was hostile to Ethan right after and was acting like a supervillain when Ethan ran into him prior to the Moreau boss fight.
Ethan! I gotta say, I'm surprised you made it this far. It'd be a shame if something happened to you now.
Sure, Chris. Why not? You killed Mia. Now do me and finish the job.
I just don't know why Chris would even do this other than to contrive a mystery for the story. The reason he gives is that he thought if Ethan knew what Miranda was up to, Ethan was going to want to get involved in the mission. So therefore, it was somehow better to keep him completely in the dark and thinking his wife got shot and baby was abducted. That certainly wouldn't make Ethan fucking Winters get involved, the man who traveled to Louisiana to rescue Mia from the Baker house after 3 years of no contact. And what do you know? Ethan then got involved, which made Chris angry for some reason, only finally relenting and giving Ethan a weapon to use against Heisenberg. Which leads to the Heisenberg boss fight where he kills the guy, but then Ethan gets seemingly murdered by Mother Miranda. The story only lampshades how Chris caused all this in the final section where you play as him.
I know it's too late now, but we really should have told Ethan the plan.
There wasn't time. We didn't expect Miranda to act so soon.
Even so, you should have told him.
Yeah.
This part is fun because Chris just has a shit ton of ammo and wrecks guys up, but like, the writing up to this point made no sense for Chris specifically, which is pretty bad because his shooting Mia/Miranda at Ethan's house is the inciting incident of the story. That's not to say Chris is always perfect. I mean, in RE6, the whole plot was that he became a drunk after he thought he failed his unit, but I still felt like that was believable. But by the time of RE8's plot, he's been doing this war on bioweapons for over 20 years. And I don't mean in our time, I mean the game timeline. Like, Chris and Jill were in the Spencer Mansion in RE1 in 1998. Chris is here in Miranda's village in 2021. The guy has seen some serious action. I just don't know how he would ever think this was a good plan. While I'm talking about Chris Redfield, there's one nagging thing that really bothers me about his character across the entire franchise, and it would be the fact that Capcom seemingly doesn't have a lot of respect for the fact that a voice does a lot to bring a character to life. I feel like having a consistent voice can really help a character feel in character regardless of what's happening. But Christ, Chris Redfield might be one of the most recast characters in gaming history. I'm not gonna say Capcom doesn't respect the actors as people. I don't work for them, I don't know. And I'm not saying that the recasts do a bad job. Far from it. In fact, in RE8, Chris is voiced by Jeff Shine, who also played Carlos in the RE3 remake. It's easy to recognize, but you can tell he's playing two different people, and he's good as Chris. I just think constantly switching up the voices of the characters kind of sucks, because it's like the audience is constantly being reintroduced to the same character over and over again.
I'm Chris Redfield from the Alpha team. Are you the only person here from the Bravo team?
I came here looking for a certain girl. Have you seen anyone named Claire Redfield?
Chris Redfield, Alpha Team. We're here to rescue you.
Just Chris, thanks. So you'll be accompanying me to the destination?
I got a job. We need your help.
No. Ethan Winters has been secured. He's alive and well considering.
3 years trying to put this thing in the ground. 3 years too long.
In the earlier games, it made sense. I'm not saying the Chris from RE1 or Code Veronica needed to be the longtime voice, but like, Roger Craig Smith from RE5 and 6, he was great, and it seemed like that was just how Chris's voice was gonna be going forward, only for us to get the RE7 Chris who genuinely feels like a completely different character. The voice cast in RE7 and 8 and the remakes of 2 through 4 have been pretty consistent. You know, it's the same Ethan and Mia in RE7 and 8, and it's the same Leon in RE2 and 4 remakes. So they've been more consistent lately, which I hope stays that way because these current actors have been pretty involved with the community and really love doing it. I'd hate to see them get replaced again. Though they did recast Chris between RE7 and 8, and they also recast Ada between the RE2 and 4 remakes, so I guess no one's truly safe in this business, but I'm just saying, I hope Capcom doesn't do it again. Anyway, in the final act, we learn what's going on in this game. Miranda is this super old person, but she's kept herself alive with various experiments. The reason she tries to keep living is because her daughter passed away young like 100 years ago, so she's been trying with all her might to bring her daughter, Eva, back. In fact, Miranda corresponded with Oswald Spencer back before he formed the Umbrella Corporation. Her research was too limiting for him since she only cared about bringing Eva back, but she did inspire him to make Umbrella and start the research on bioweapons that led to the T-virus that kicked off the whole series. All the villains Ethan had to fight, like Lady Dimitrescu and Heisenberg, were failed experiments attempting to find a vessel to bring Eva back. They just became enforcers for Miranda instead. It also turns out that the reason for Evelyn's existence in RE7 was that she was another attempt at bringing Eva back, which didn't quite succeed because of how unstable Evelyn was. This is where the Winters family comes into the picture. Ethan and Mia were both infected with the mold during their time with the Baker house. Miranda and her megamycete is where the mold comes from, and it's using that which will help her bring Eva back. Ethan and Mia's exposure to it somehow has rested in their DNA, and therefore Rose has superhuman abilities while not being unstable like Evelyn was. That's why Rose is the target. After you finish playing as Chris, you even get an explanation for why Ethan is so hilariously durable, and it's because of the mold. Evelyn appears to Ethan in a dream and explains that his ass got killed by Jack Baker within the first 30 minutes of RE7. But then the mold he was exposed to was how he got his hand back, and how in RE8 he just survives a ridiculous amount of shit, up to and including his arm getting cut off and him literally putting it back on. Now, how you could explain Ethan's durability in his fight with possessed Mia before he got killed? Well, that clearly can be explained by the fact that he just has unstoppable spirit and will to live, I guess. The mold is how Ethan is even continuing to live now after Miranda took his heart out. I went into all those details because, like I said, I think RE8's story is largely enjoyable. The villains are entertaining and have believable motivations, and RE8 does a great job recontextualizing RE7 and turning the two games into a really strong narrative duo about the mold and Evelyn and the Winters family. RE8 really making Ethan one of the coolest badasses in the series. You know, Chris and Jill and Leon and Claire were all these action movie badasses, many of whom had super agent training to make them so capable. But Ethan's so cool because he's just a dude who's motivated by nothing more than a want to protect his wife and daughter. Now, he has mold-powered regeneration, but he didn't at the start of 7, and he still showed up anyway. That, to me, makes him a cool character, especially at the end here. Ethan's on the brink of death, and he still takes the fight to Miranda to save Rose. And on my first playthrough, I got my butt royally handed to me in the final boss, so I stocked up a bunch of ammo for it here and cleared it first try, as Ethan becomes more unstable with Miranda dead and the Mega Mycete destroyed. Ethan sacrifices himself so that Chris can take Rose to safety, which is one of the first times where an RE game made me genuinely feel kind of emotional, because Ethan deserves a happy ending, but he's willingly sacrificing himself because that's what needs to be done. RE8 ending on the note of Rose as a 16-year-old girl honoring her father at his grave, which was a sweet ending for the game at the time of its release, but has become more so with time. Resident Evil 8 wasn't going to get DLC like RE7 did, but by popular demand, we got post-launch content for Resident Evil Village. The Mercenaries mode returned, and we even got a third-person mode where you can play RE8 from a third-person perspective, like, say, the remakes of RE2 through 4. It's kinda weird to me, to be honest. I'm just so used to RE7 and 8 being directly from Ethan's point of view that seeing it like this is really weird. The cutscenes also return to Ethan's POV, so I feel like it's just better to play in first person. But that's up to you, it's the same game either way. But the most important bit of post-game content is the Shadows of Rose storyline. This fleshes out the original ending by letting players take control of 16-year-old Rose. She's a social outcast because of her horrifying powers, and she learns that she can get rid of them by finding a purifying crystal that lives inside the only remaining fungal root from the giant one that Ethan and Chris destroyed in the main story. Rose uses her powers to mentally go inside of it, and you get a campaign of some remixed level design from the main game, only you play as Rose. During the portion that takes place in Lady D's castle, I didn't think much of this mode. It was alright. I guessed that Ethan's spirit was Rose's guardian angel from moment 1, but still, it was decent. But then I changed my tune the more I played of this. In the Beneviento house section, things got really interesting. Gameplay-wise, there's this one great part where you have to get through this room, but if you take your eyes off these mannequin dolls, they'll follow you and kill you. It's simple, but their movement is so uncanny, and seeing their glowing eyes in the dark was terrifying. When I saw one of those things walking towards me for the first time, I am genuinely admitting I actually screamed. But then the story ramped up here too, as Evelyn's spirit lives in this realm too, not just Ethan's, as Ethan tries to save Rose from Evelyn. But the story here just got me feeling sympathetic for many of the characters. Rose, naturally, because she's been considered a freak by other kids for reasons that are totally out of her control, something that Evelyn keeps putting in Rose's face here. But then, all these games make me feel really bad for Evelyn too. Ethan's closing remark in RE7 was that everything here was Evelyn's fault, not the Bakers, which was true. But Evelyn didn't choose to be a lab rat. All she wants now is just parents who care about her, but she goes about it in these destructive, villainous ways. Her behavior makes her the villain, but you do understand why she would hate Rose in this section. Evelyn wanted Mia and Ethan to be her parents, but they didn't want her and fought to escape her control. And now they have their own actual daughter they care about. It makes sense why someone like Evelyn would hate Rose. It's sad in a way because this whole thing is a plot by Miranda, who also lives in the fungal root. Miranda wants her kid back, and Evelyn wants a mother. They're both right there, but can't give each other what they want, because Miranda sees Evelyn as a failed attempt to bring her original daughter back and cares nothing for anyone who fails their purpose in that sense. The final act of this DLC managed to make me emotional again, because Rose does get rid of her powers, but it was Miranda's plan to depower Rose so she could be used to bring Eva back. Ethan fighting to no avail to save Rose, who then destroys the purifying crystal so she can get her powers back and save Ethan and kill Miranda for good. And at the end, she gets one-on-one time with her long-deceased father. This conversation between them was genuinely heartfelt, one of the most emotional moments in the series for me, which isn't a high bar, but still. Guess I'm just a sucker for this kind of storyline. Though it's kind of comedic how the scenes are shot so specifically that they never show Ethan's face. Since that's the running gag with RE7 and RE8 is that you'll never see Ethan Winters' face. It's kind of funny, but it does take you out of the moment a little bit. Might have been a nice dramatic reveal to show Ethan's face once and for all in his very final scene. But either way, Shadows of Rose ends with the same gravestone ending as the main game, but now, thanks to the DLC, it's more emotional, since you just have more connection to Rose as a character and have seen why visiting her dad now means as much to her as it does, since she did get to meet him after all. Which is a very satisfying ending for Resident Evil Village, a game that I thought was pretty cool. That's pretty much the only way I can summarize the game though, which is exactly what I said about it in 2021. I remember being asked what I thought of it by a friend, and I was like, yeah, that was a good game, which sounded kind of negative since my reaction to RE2 Remake, or later RE4 Remake, was, oh my god, this is incredible. But no, I don't mean anything disparaging about RE8 and saying I think it's good. I enjoy it. Like, it doesn't execute the core principles of Resident Evil like the best of any game, but no one game has all four elements at their peak anyway. The fact that in my eyes RE8 is good at all of them is worth something. I don't plan on revisiting it anytime soon, but when I do, I'm gonna enjoy it. The levels are fun and tense, the story has good emotional moments, the visuals are stunning even years later. The game is quite good. If I had to do an RE tier list, RE8 would be in the B tier, which for me means it's a good game, no questions asked. Not the greatest game I've ever played, but I like it. And I think it's well worth your time if you're an RE fan or not. I know someone who loved it and played it for several playthroughs back to back, so it's a case where your mileage may vary, but I think it's a good game. And what more could you want?
And now, to close the video, we'll circle back to the Resident Evil 4 Remake, which was the next game after RE8, and we'll see how the format has evolved since the original RE4 to produce a pretty sick remake.
To understand what made Resident Evil 4 so great begins with two important points from its development. RE4 Remake was made from the same division of Capcom that made the Resident Evil 2 Remake, which is one of the best games of last generation. Remaking RE2 was easy for them to envision. Take the original game on PS1 and adapt the idea into a modern third-person shooter type game. However, Resident Evil 4 is the game that grandfathered in the modern third-person shooter. Every single game that looks like this is one that Resi 4 inspired. You simply cannot recapture something as groundbreaking as that in a remake. At the same time, you then wonder, what do we do with this project? Because Resident Evil 4 is a game widely available on just about every platform made since its original release, and is still held up as one of the greatest games ever to this day. I like how they stated it wasn't a matter of looking at other current games or later RE games and deciding to replicate them. It was instead a deep dive into the original RE4 and thinking about what ways they could expand on what was already there. But RE4 is a big-ass game. It was a multi-hour campaign as Leon exploring a village, a castle, and an island. You gotta maintain that DNA. So early in the process, the team split into three. One that was dedicated to creating the village portion, another for the castle, and another for the island. And then comparing notes later to see how it was working out. That way, it was guaranteed that all three received proper attention. This game started development before the remake of Resident Evil 3 that another team handled, but I'd imagine that the lukewarm response that game got definitely convinced the team they were going in the right direction here. I've always been in a weird spot with the RE3 remake since I've never really thought it was anything more than okay, which seems to pit me at odds with RE fans who think it's overhated and RE fans who think it's the worst thing ever. I also think it's overhated because the game is fine and has some good parts and ideas, but still, as a remake of the PS1 classic, it really dropped the ball. Several areas and bosses from the original game were nowhere to be seen, and what was in their place was absolutely not a decent replacement, like taking out the Dead Factory final level and replacing it with another generic lab. But this video is not about Resident Evil 3 Remake. I'm just saying that RE3 2020 abandoning so much of the content from the original makes it even easier to recognize how great of a move it was from the developers of RE4 to divide the team in a way that ensured each location from the original game was maintained. That doesn't mean it's a beat-for-beat remake, but it's still RE4. From there, the team looked at RE4 from a mechanical standpoint and thought about ways to improve the gameplay. For example, they looked at the QuickTime events and decided they wanted to remove these. But what does that mean for the iconic Krauser fight? Well, what if you instead have to time your button presses to dodge with the knife? That's pretty cool. But what if? What if that was a thing throughout the whole game, and thus the parry system was born? When enemies throw things at Leon or charge at him with their weapons or fists, correctly timing the knife button will allow you to block the attack, or just cleanly slice off the enemy combatant's arm and then you go in for a melee attack. This is so satisfying and is completely game-changing for the RE4 combat loop, when the original was already a really satisfying system of aiming for critical points to get in melee attacks, and this blends with that perfectly. The original RE4 allowed you to deflect certain projectiles by shooting them out of the air, which was already satisfying to pull off, and now you can do that for basically any incoming attack, including chainsaw-wielding enemies. I was already sold on the game from the reveal trailer, but then the first gameplay showcase revealing you could parry a chainsaw with your knife was the moment I knew this was going to be an amazing game. I just think perfect dodge mechanics add a lot to games because they require some practice to get right, which means you need to learn enemy patterns and timing and then feel like a gaming god when you execute perfectly. It is just really satisfying and never gets old. The designers said that going back to the original RE4 felt weird now because they got used to the parry system they cooked up and felt like it was missing when replaying the original game. And I can definitely say that I felt the same way when I replayed that game for this video, as it would have been really useful when getting crowded by enemies, and I even thought the same way when I played Resident Evil 5 for the first time a few weeks back. This one addition is completely game-changing if you ask me. However, I don't think it stops there. In the past, I've discussed how I think Resident Evil game design can be loosely boiled down to 4 categories: resource management, tension, exploration, and replayability. How these games do these various things will differ between them, but those are the core elements. RE4 gets so much depth as an experience by taking the ways the original RE4 succeeded at those things and going even further with it. Starting with resource management, the OG RE4 did this really well because of its grid-based inventory system. You had to carefully arrange the items in your case so that they all fit, and if something couldn't fit, you had to leave it behind or use/sell the things you've been holding on to that are taking up space. RE4 was a game where ammo was everywhere though, so you never had to worry about it much. In RE4 Remake, resource management is stronger because of some new mechanics that were never in the original. You could mix herbs together for different health effects, and that's still in the new version, but new to RE4 is gunpowder mixing. You'll find resources both large and small, and these can be combined with gunpowder to create different kinds of ammo, and you'll buy recipes from the merchant to give yourself the ability to craft more varieties of ammo. Past the original Resident Evil 3, I think this is the most in-depth the gunpowder system has ever been, since I was constantly putting thought into what ammo I wanted to craft to best suit whatever situation I was in, and that's something important to RE4 Remake because ammo isn't as accessible in the world as it was in the original. You still find ammo a lot in the remake, but the amount of bullets you'd gain from this didn't feel nearly as high as the original. So you get less ammo, which means you want to conserve those resources as best you can, and you do so by making it a priority to aim for the weak spots and do melee attacks. And then you need to assess your combat needs when crafting ammo or grenades. You need to make sure your knife's durability is upgraded and repaired when broken to make sure you won't be in a situation where you can't parry, because knives break in this game like they did in the RE2 remake. This is another element of decision making I really liked about this game. How you can escape grabs by either mashing X at the cost of some health or breaking free instantly with your knife at the cost of its durability meter. It felt like a nice combination of the systems the RE2 and 3 remakes had. But anyway, the one area where I thought RE4 Remake didn't hold up as well in the resource management category was the one the original excelled at the most. You still have the same inventory system of items on a grid, but customizing your case in the original game was like a game in and of itself. Now you have this handy auto sort button that instantly configures your case to be at its most space efficient, which takes all the fun out of it. You can still organize your case independently if you really want to, but I feel like the game doesn't encourage that. In the interest of fairness, I think they did it to keep the pace up, which I get. That's also the reason why the game has real-time weapon switching when the original game only let you switch weapons by pausing the game and selecting it from your inventory. But the point is, that game just revolved around this case a lot more than the remake, which prefers keeping you in the action as much as possible. So therefore, the inventory management itself was very much lessened. But the subject of keeping you in the action leads swimmingly into the tension category. When diving into the combat mechanics, there are things I prefer in the original game, and there are things I prefer in the remake. I just went into the parrying a few moments ago, which I think transcends the original combat. But like I just said, I don't think everything is a 100% improvement on that level. But I also don't think there are definitive downgrades either, just a different system. In RE4, you couldn't move while aiming, which inherently created tension as enemies got closer and closer. But you had this laser pointer aim, which made accuracy pretty simple. Leon's hand would shake like a person's would, but I think the laser sight system made it pretty easy to be accurate is all I'm saying. In RE4 Remake, the game brings back the aiming system the RE2 Remake had. This is one where you have crosshairs that are large and they get smaller if you hold still, allowing for more accuracy. I just think this aiming system was better suited to that game than this one. In something like RE2 Remake, you're mostly fighting against slow-ass T-virus zombies, so having a shaky aim while moving that can only be steadied by stopping feels like a good balance to that. In this game, enemies move so quickly and have an abundance of attacks, so I didn't really feel like this style of aiming added much. But that leads to a system that you can complement the game for. Since there are different handguns, they have different levels of precision, and some of them can be attached with a laser pointer, and when I did that with the Punisher, I was getting a lot more headshots in. So the aiming experience can be improved while playing. All the weapons are really satisfying to use with explosive sound design and enemies getting knocked back and blown away by them. It really is a great combat system that leads to tense situations because the enemies in this game are no joke. They crowd you, they try to grab you and hold you while another enemy will try to impale you, and there's a decent variety of enemies too. Like the original, you'll still have the basic types like the villagers, cultists, and the guys who patrol the island, but now they just have more diverse weapons and tactics, scaling in difficulty too. Like how the cultists use wooden shields you can blow away with a shotgun, but when you get to the island, the enemies will have metal shields, so you can't do that and you have to aim for their legs to defeat them. The remake introduces new types of enemies not seen in the OG game, like these big guys with animal heads that take a lot of damage but are really fun to dispose of. Like this one who uses an arm-mounted rapid-fire weapon on you, you can just shoot it and make it explode, which is one of the most satisfying moments from my first playthrough of this game. You're up against some pretty fierce competition, but with all these tools at your disposal, you'll still feel like it's a fair challenge. With the more limited ammo and the darker atmosphere the game also has, this leads to an increase in the scare factor too. I love how they introduced regenerators by having you read about them and seeing their x-ray, and then when I first saw one I was like, oh shit, even though I knew it was coming. Though, on my first playthrough, aiming for those Plagas weak spots with the x-ray scope was the first moment where I felt like the aiming wasn't precise enough for my liking, but I had a much easier time with it on this playthrough than I did last year, which also goes for the whole game, I suppose. Upon the replay, I felt like the game's Ashley system was kind of a strategic downgrade. In the original, she had one of three states: following you exactly, standing completely in place, or hiding whenever that was an option. In the remake, they made her AI a little more real, and that you could have her closely follow you or hang back while trying to stay out of trouble. When the game first came out, I thought this was pretty exciting since that meant you couldn't just have her freeze in place whenever it would be convenient. However, her AI being so predictable in the original made it easier to work with. Now, I don't even see the point of having her hang back because she can only take 2 hits before dying, so making Ashley follow you closely is the best way to avoid that happening. She also doesn't have a health bar you can increase like you could in the original, so that's another bit of strategy taken out. And she still is allowed to hide in sections that'll be too hectic, like when you're attacked by the twin chainsaw ladies. Which makes sense, but still, I just think the way the OG game handled it was more of an active part of the game and your strategy, when now she's just kinda there. She'd get grabbed sometimes, but it's pretty easy to stop that. With the way the remake handles it, it's like a weird middling point between RE4, where you need to strategically think about what Ashley should be doing at all times, and something like The Last of Us, where Ellie is an aid to you that almost never gets in trouble. Not really having the strengths of either one. But I'm not saying that's some game-breaking issue, I just thought that was one area where the original gave you more to think about and plan around. But speaking of The Last of Us, the new stealth mechanics in RE4 Remake remind me of those games, as does the HUD and the UI. But I think RE4's stealth doesn't really do much for the game, as Leon isn't very mobile when sneaking around, so oftentimes it would be impractical to do so when shooting is much easier and basically an inevitability in just about every room. But now I'm just rambling about my thoughts on all the mechanics, so let's get back to the core pillars of RE. In regards to the exploration factor of RE4 Remake, this is a category where the developers really cooked with fire. Numerous segments have been expanded to give players more to work with and look around for. For example, in the original game, you could get back on the lake after the monster fight and look around, though there wasn't a lot to see here. But in the remake, there's a whole main quest of gathering pieces to get to the church, but also plenty to find by driving this boat to little spots in the water like finding a golden egg or going to this ship and finding a free red 9 in a chest. This game consistently was a more rewarding experience in terms of exploration. The original game was pretty linear, and while the remake also is, there's a benefit to exploring previously unexplored areas. When you first get to the village, there's this building you can't get into, and you return with Ashley to give her a boost so she can open the door and you can find what's inside. You can return to the chief's house and do the same thing to get into the attic. The remake injects that classic RE exploration into the RE4 experience, and I'm absolutely here for it. The OG game had a system where certain treasures could be combined with gems to enhance their value, and the remake really expanded on this by giving you different bonuses for gem color combos and by making more treasures customizable like this, which adds more depth to the system. The merchant in his shop has been enhanced as you still sell, buy, and upgrade weapons, but you can also do these side quests for him where you get spinels for completing them that you use to trade for high value items like the TMP stock that absorbs recoil. This forces you to look around or fight a tough enemy or explore an area you might otherwise not look through, like how you battle a big knight armor enemy in the Ashley section of the castle if you decide to explore it thoroughly as Leon. This sense of exploration is a consistent factor throughout the whole game. Then some select merchant shops have the shooting gallery game from the original brought back, only expanded to reward you with these tokens that can be used to get these tiny add-ons to your inventory case for special perks, giving this system more of a rewarding feeling than it used to have. Needless to say, the team did a really great job with the exploration element of the game. Though, talking about exploration merits a mention of the yellow paint controversy. RE4 Remake routinely guides players by having interactable objects and progression points dumped with yellow paint to make sure it grabs your attention and separates it from the things that are not interactable. This has made some people mighty upset. It became a meme when RE4 did it so much, but then became more so when the recently released Final Fantasy VII Rebirth also did this. Games from, say, 20 years ago, or even like 10 to 15 years ago, were able to do this subtly because non-interactable objects were even lower res than the rest of the game already was, which made it easy to ignore if you were playing it. But now, when everything is detailed realistically, devs need to find ways to make sure most every player can get through the game. You're probably going to keep seeing yellow paint because, as this tweet put it really succinctly, RE4 Remake put yellow paint into the lexicon of gaming. Anything that is not already there needs to be explained, but now you're primed to know what this means when you see it. I can see all sides of the argument here, but I would first like to say that I believe a lot of people who are venomously angry about yellow paint on Twitter are usually the kinds of people who just use it as an excuse to jerk themselves off for being superior beings to those damn normies who ruin my games. Why can't devs just cater to people who aren't stupid? When, if you're a designer, you playtest games with people who don't know anything about what you're making and use that to make sure the game is fair and balanced and to find blind spots that they or a series veteran might overlook. I just always have a problem with hipster gamers touting how superior they are to random people they've never met. It drives me crazy to no end. I wanted to call it out. But that's not to say that because this is a solution to the problem of player guidance, it automatically is good. It's possible to guide players around in games in ways that are infinitely more subtle than this. Take The Last of Us as an example again, and you can get a sense of what I mean. In those games, players are discouraged from going places they aren't supposed to by having those buildings be in ruins, entrances blocked by debris or plant overgrowth. That way you naturally go on the main path or explore side paths that are available. Now, not every game has the easy excuse of taking place 20 years after the fall of society, but it is an example nevertheless. The longer I played the game, the yellow paint got funnier and funnier because at a certain point you have to ask, who even painted the clock tower with yellow paint anyway? I'm just picturing the merchant thinking this was the only way to lead customers to his store or some shit. Interestingly, it ends up being a reminder that you're in a video game world, betraying the graphical style the game goes for. But on the other hand, I'm not someone who cares that much. When you have a game this fun and well made with all this much depth as an experience, this just becomes a passing footnote. But I'm getting mildly off subject. The last pillar of RE to me is replay value, something this game does quite well. The game keeps a good pace and offers rankings and stat breakdowns for every chapter and the whole game. Apparently, getting an S requires beating the entire game in under 5 hours. It took me 10 hours for this playthrough, so I don't know if I'll ever pull that one off, but then in-game, the designers considered all kinds of ways to make the game worth revisiting. Like how you can skip the in-game scenes where Hunnigan and Leon are talking over the communicator, or how the game is loaded with details that show how much thought and care went into it. We all know the opening village fight ends when Ada rings the bell at the church, but if you have the right weapons, you can actually end the fight early by shooting the bell yourself from really far away. Or how this scene in the castle will normally involve an enemy pulling a switch that brings you down to this huge room with dozens of enemies that can be pretty tough. But if you have explosive mines, you can place it so that it kills the switch pulling enemy before he even does it, allowing you to quickly grab the item and go. These kinds of details are only in a game that had a lot of time, care, and thought put into it. And dare I say, soul even. And that's just me talking about the base game we got a year ago. I think this game absolutely stands tall when you take the hype out of the equation, and I was glad to see it. But then the replayability was furthered by the DLC. A little bit after launch, we got the Mercenaries mode completely for free, and then later the game was given an update for the PSVR 2 and a paid-for Separate Ways campaign. I loved playing the original RE4 in VR and would love to try this game too, but I don't have a PSVR and definitely won't be getting one with how expensive it is, so I'll just talk about the DLC I do have. The Mercenaries mode is a lot of fun in the original RE4, but this is just way better. The rules are basically the same, killing as many enemies as possible within the time limit and extending the time with item pickups, but it's been changed to make it a lot more fun because you have more characters to play as. Leon, Luis, Hunk, Krauser, Ada, and Wesker. Each character has their own limited roster of weapons, so you need to work with that and find which character you like playing as the most. But I liked every character for what unique elements they brought to the table, like how Krauser can just go combo mad with the knife attacks, or how Wesker can use his superpowers to just dodge everything with his bare hands and teleport to enemies for melee attacks. And then when his gauge fills up, you can become even faster and have more attacks, like turning Krauser into his monster form and just flying through enemies. I've gotten like over 100 enemies in one combo while playing this numerous times. I think this is the Mercenaries mode I had the most fun playing. Sometimes I just turn this game on for this mode alone and play it for over half an hour. It's really addicting. And then there's the Separate Ways campaign. I was really excited to see them bring this back because I never liked the original one very much. Separate Ways was a campaign starring Ada that was added to the PS2 release of RE4 to give it a little extra something to make it worth buying. It was pretty clearly just made using level assets that already existed with some minimal new segments. Now, the new Separate Ways is also an asset flip in many respects, however, it feels more original. Already I was hyped by this campaign when I heard the menu use this remix of the RE2 PS1 Ada theme. That was pretty cool. But then when you play it, Ada's pretty fun to work with. The Separate Ways campaign comes with all the same great systems from the remake, like the side quests and the weapon upgrades and such. And then Ada herself plays pretty similarly to Leon, though I really enjoyed how her grapple gun is now something that she can use in combat, as you can grapple up to enemies from far away or tear their shields down. And there will be many new segments included that were not in the remake's Leon campaign. The developers used this as a chance to bring back segments from the original game that were not in the remake, like the U3 boss fight, an extended tour of the castle sewers with the bugs, or the spike wall chase, or the lift with the enemies on it. They even brought back the laser room from the OG game and made it kind of a reference to the original live-action RE movie, which was pretty cool. Resident Evil 4 was a pretty long game, and so cutting some of those segments and placing them in the other campaign does wonders for the pacing of both, I'd say. It allows the main campaign to not feel like it overstays its welcome at all, and it allows Separate Ways to feel more like a fleshed out campaign by having more content. The original never felt like a proper campaign with its own story to tell, it was just what was Ada doing at this point of the story. Whereas the remake gives Ada an arc and an enemy to fight. She was infected with Las Plagas right at the beginning and is chased by this huge enemy, giving her a nemesis figure and a struggle to overcome while still working for Wesker and trying to get the Amber from Luis. She wants to help Luis aid Leon because deep down she cares, and gradually questions Wesker more and more throughout the story. A detail right from the beginning I liked was how Ada says she's done many missions without question, but Raccoon City changed her. Leon made her a more empathetic person, and after this mission she refuses to give Wesker the Amber because he's going to use it in his scheme to kill billions. But the ending teases that he doesn't even need the Amber now, he can just use Krauser's body to get what he needs. This campaign selling me on the change to Krauser's true intentions. In the OG game, he was this triple agent working for both Sadler and Wesker, but having only Ada work for Wesker and Krauser only working for Sadler makes the story simpler while also bringing it to the same conclusion and expanding on the characters along the way. Which is also how I can sum up my thoughts on the main game's story. As they stated in development, they wanted to expand on the characters. I said Ada was evidently changed by Raccoon City, but there's no better example of those events having an impact than Leon himself. RE4 Leon is famous for creating the quippy action hero Leon we're all familiar with today. The remake still gives him some good one-liners and action hero moments, so it absolutely feels like RE4 Leon, but I just like how they made the character darker. Not in an edgy way, but a realistic one given his experiences. The original Leon from RE2 and the one from RE4 always felt like different characters to me, and I don't just mean the change in voice acting. I always accepted that they were the same character, but RE4 Leon just treats being in the zombie apocalypse on his first day as a police officer in such a matter-of-fact way that it never really felt like it was that big of a deal to him, past the opening monologue of the game.
Somehow I managed to get myself involved with the incident in Raccoon City on my first day in the Force.
That is the incident with the viral outbreak, right?
I get it though. RE4 was trying to go in somewhat of a new direction, so the past wasn't going to be a big focus for the character. Credit to RE6, I felt like this was the first game where that backstory weighed on Leon as a character. But anyway, in RE4 Remake, they were able to take Leon's character from the RE2 Remake and work with that to make the story even stronger. In that remake, Leon was characterized as this really nice, optimistic guy who wanted to help other people at all costs.
I want to find out what's happening here, and stop whoever's behind it. Helping people like them? That's why I joined the Force.
My mission is to take down Umbrella's entire operation. We may not make it out.
Whatever it takes to save this city. Count me in.
Being one of like 7 people who survived that night while the whole rest of the city got blown off the face of the earth is naturally something that this Leon would be upset by. In addition to all the trauma incurred by meeting so many people he couldn't save, like Marvin or Ada.
Raccoon City. You know, after the incident, the world changed. You try to save one person, 100 others die. I guess I changed too.
You? Leon S. Kennedy. You haven't changed. You just think you have.
Not to say the original RE2 Leon isn't a nice, optimistic guy, I'm just saying that I feel like the remake really expanded upon that element of the character. So now, rescuing Ashley from Los Illuminados isn't just his mission, it's also really important to him because he can't fail to save yet another person. While Leon is on the brink of death marching towards the lab with Ashley to hopefully cure themselves of Las Plagas, he's going on about how it has to be different this time, and that had a lot of dramatic weight to it that the original never had. The infection plot in general just felt more pronounced in this version. Honestly, in the original game, you'd sometimes forget Leon and Ashley were even infected at all until it becomes occasionally relevant in cutscenes, but in gameplay, Leon is fine. They don't make the infection something that gets in the way of gameplay here, but there are segments where you'll be impacted by it, which keeps the infection in your mind while playing. Plus, the scenes with Leon and Ashley being infected feel more dramatic too. Ashley has a really nice character arc in this as well. Starting the game really afraid to even jump out of a window, but Leon's daring antics to save her throughout boosts her confidence and motivates her to help and get involved in whatever limited ways she can, like tossing blue fire at the statues when you have to fight them, making her useful in the gameplay, and that makes you like the character more. Luis was done over in a similar fashion. In the OG game, he just walked in and out of the plot whenever he was useful, and then he died out of what felt like nowhere. Here, he's given more characterization and screen time, and the motivation of wanting to help Leon and Ashley to clear his conscience. He was a former Umbrella researcher, which obviously makes Leon not trust him at the start, but Luis is a genuine guy who really wants to help and is pretty useful. Also forming a gameplay connection with the player through extended team-up sections. Leon came to really respect him for everything he did for both him and Ashley. His death still felt kinda sad to watch in my second playthrough as a result. Especially after playing separate ways, where you really see how hard he worked to try and undo the damage he's done. Luis being killed by Krauser was also an improvement if you ask me. His character also came out of nowhere in the original, and then you had to fight him in the third act. But him killing a character you liked, such as Luis, makes him hateable instantly. And then you get dropped with more backstory that he was the one who gave Leon the super cool agent training between games before Krauser ended up joining Sadler for the sake of getting more power. Though, on the note of villains, I did like how we see Sadler's influence over those infected and how it works in this version of the story, but I will admit I thought the really hammy versions of Salazar and Sadler in the OG game were just more entertaining. Like, they just call Leon up and they'd riff back and forth for a bit. Where the remake does win out is the boss fights. They just took the concepts of each boss encounter and dialed it up to 11, like the village chief grabbing all the debris in the burning farm and tossing it at you. Many of these fights take advantage of your increased mobility while shooting by giving the boss fights the same treatment. Salazar is way more fun to fight with him flying all over the room and shooting projectiles than when he just stood there in the center of the room. Many bosses have been improved, like the Verdugo encounter giving you more room to work with and fight in, and the Twin Gigantes being this team up with Luis that was a lot of fun. The Krauser fight's taking advantage of the knife mechanics really well, unlike the original game where you could break the fight entirely with the knife, and then Sadler gets this massive arena that's way bigger than the fight was in the OG game. But either way, the final boss is pretty climactic as Leon defeats Sadler, and he and Ada say the thing.
I think we both know this. It's where we go our separate ways.
Narrowly escaping the island before it blows up, ending Resident Evil 4 Remake and this little look back on the game. After replaying both games recently, I was left wondering which of these I actually preferred. A year ago, I said I was leaning towards the remake because of how much it improved on the systems from the original game, but now, I don't know. I think it's really difficult for me to say which I actually like better than the other. When I replayed the original game, I was thinking that I preferred the original for how snappy it is and the controls and the shooting, and I felt like I might replay this game sooner than the remake. But then, while replaying the remake, I could not put the controller down. Whenever I'd stop a recording session, I'd be hungering for another one. So now I think both Resident Evil 4s are complete and utter masterpieces. I don't have a favorite. I think the original dev team made an all-time classic that I could play any day of the week, and the remake team took another stab at that iconic game and landed with another all-time great. worthy of the accolades it received. Games like RE4 Remake are why I don't definitively say what games should or should not receive remakes. Most said RE4 didn't need a remake before it came out. I even said it was going to be an impossible task before it got announced. But now I have two versions of this game that I think are both S-class games. These two, alongside RE2 Remake, are my favorite games in the series, with the original RE2 and the RE1 Remake following closely behind. I'm merely a fan of great games, no matter what form they come from, or if it's a remake of some already established great game.
And now we have Resident Evil Requiem, which I covered for the first time a couple weeks ago, so I won't include that, just check that out for my full thoughts on that game. But to use the closing thoughts, this game sold 5 million copies just a couple days. Its day one player count on Steam was also an all-time high for the RE series. This game is a massive success, and that's coming after RE7 and 8 and the remakes of 2, 3, and 4, which were all hugely financially successful. Critical successes too, except for the not very good one, but we can forget about that for now. My point is, in the last decade, Resident Evil has been on a near unending winning streak, which is why I think it's the best series in gaming right now. RE9 is just a great game for fans and non-fans alike. And now I just look forward to what's next. If Dusk Golem, the prominent RE leaker, is to be believed, it's time for the Code Veronica remake next, and then RE0, and then RE10, and now we're hearing that another RE1 remake is after that. So I'm excited for all that, since the people behind these games keep producing banger games. It even makes me excited to see my least favorite RE game, RE0, back in action. But that's for the future. At the moment, I'm just glad to have another sick-ass Resident Evil game in my collection. And what more could you want from a new game than that?